Section 1. The background art that tells a whole story. Nobody noticed. Let's start somewhere most people never look. When you watch The Simpsons, your eyes go where the writers want them to go. The second form is subtler and more interesting. The couch gag that, without explicitly adopting another show's style, references something about that show's philosophy or approach in a way that only viewers familiar with both shows would catch. These gags don't make the front pages of entertainment news. They're not press release-worthy events. They're private conversations between one show and another, conducted through a public medium, legible only to the audience that has done the viewing necessary to understand what's being said. The couch gags that function as private conversations with other animated shows are some of the most fascinating documents in the history of the format, precisely because they require this double knowledge of The Simpsons and knowledge of the other show, to fully decode. They're designed for fans who are also fans of something else. Now let's look at the couch gags that comment on the act of watching television itself. The Simpsons has always been meta in its relationship with its own medium. It's a television show that frequently, sometimes obsessively, comments on what television is and does. The couch gag is the most compressed venue for this meditation, because the image of a family running to a couch to watch television, which is, abstractly, what the couch gag depicts, is an image of the act of watching The Simpsons. Every couch gag where something goes wrong with the couch, where it swallows the family, explodes, transforms into something unrecognizable, is a gag about the act of watching television, about what it means to organize domestic life around this ritual, about what happens when the ritual fails or becomes strange. The couch is the altar of suburban domestic ritual. Things going wrong with it are things going wrong with that ritual. Some of these gags push the metaphor further than others. The couch gag that ends with the family trapped inside the television they were about to watch is more explicit about the direction of its commentary than the gag that ends with them unable to fit on the couch. But both are in the same category, jokes about television watching that also contain, for the viewer attentive enough to notice, a question about what that practice means and what it costs. The couch gag where the family is pixelated, or where the family is depicted in an older or more primitive animation style, or where the family appears as live-action versions of themselves. All of these are versions of the show calling attention to its own nature as a constructed object, as animation, as something that exists on screen rather than in the world. They're reminders inserted into what is usually experienced as an unbroken viewing ritual, that what you're watching was made by people, with choices, in a process, and that none of it had to be exactly this way. The longest and most elaborate couch gags, the ones that extend well past the normal runtime, that have their own internal narrative arc, that feel like short films rather than title sequence segments, are the most extreme expression of this tendency to interrupt the ritual and make the viewer aware of what they're doing. You were comfortable. You were in the groove of the show's opening sequence, prepared to slide into the episode. The extended couch gag refuses to let you do that. It insists that you pay attention, that you notice that something different is happening, that you resist the automatic pilot of familiar viewing. This resistance to automatic pilot is, many would argue, one of the most important things The Simpsons ever did for television viewing as a practice. It trained a generation of viewers to be slightly more awake than they might otherwise be, to expect surprise within familiarity, to read the screen rather than just watch it. The couch gag is the show's most concentrated site of this training. Section 6. Throwaway lines that accidentally built a mythology. Great shows build worlds. The Simpsons built a world accidentally. This is not quite true, obviously. The writers of The Simpsons are too smart and too deliberate for anything to be truly accidental. But there's a meaningful distinction between world building that is planned and coordinated, where the rules of the fictional universe are established in advance and details are deployed strategically, and world building that happens through accumulation, through thousands of individual jokes, references, and throwaway lines that were each written for their immediate comedic effect, and that collectively, over time, constructed something much larger and more coherent than any individual joke would suggest. The Simpsons built its world through accumulation. Springfield's mythology, its history, its geography, its social structure, its relationship with the surrounding universe, exists not in any document or writer's Bible, but in the aggregate of 35 years of throwaway lines. And the most interesting thing about this accumulated mythology is how internally consistent it is, given that it was built by dozens of different writers over decades with minimal coordination. The Jebediah Springfield mythology is perhaps the clearest example of this kind of accidental world building made intentional. Jebediah Springfield, the town's founder, is introduced in a single episode, Lisa the Iconoclast, in Season 7, that constructs a complex and layered portrait of the man and what his myth means to the town. That episode is a masterwork of satirical storytelling about how communities construct heroic narratives and what those narratives do and don't accomplish. But the episode's power comes partly from the fact that Jebediah Springfield has been present in the show's background for years before this episode. In the statue in the town square, in passing references, in the general texture of Springfield's civic identity, without any of that presence being connected to a coherent story. The episode takes all those background presences and backward engineers a mythology from them. It reveals that the statue, the references, the civic pride, all attach to a figure whose historical reality is radically different from his legend. And then it argues, in a way that's both funny and genuinely moving, that this gap between reality and legend might not be a problem worth solving. But the episode only works because of years of throwaway lines about Jebediah Springfield that established his place in Springfield's self-image before anyone had thought carefully about what that self-image meant. Those lines were jokes, individual jokes, made in isolation, about the absurdity of small-town civic pride. In aggregate, they became the foundation of a story about history and myth that is among the show's finest achievements. This kind of retroactive coherence, throwaway lines that turn out to have been building something without anyone fully knowing it, happens throughout Springfield's mythology. Consider the Stonecutters. The Stonecutters appear in Homer the Great, a Season 6 episode that is often cited as one of the show's best, and they're presented there as a secret society with an elaborate mythology, history, and set of rituals. The episode's comedy comes partly from the gap between the Stonecutters' grandiose self-image, their elaborate ceremonies, their ancient traditions, their conviction that they run the world, and the mundane reality of who they are. A bunch of middle-class men from Springfield playing at power. But the Stonecutters, for the episode to work as well as it does, need to feel like they've been there all along. Like this is a secret that was always present in Springfield, waiting to be revealed. And they do feel that way, partly because the show has, for years before this episode, been dropping references to the kind of institutionalized privilege and insider networking that the Stonecutters embody. Throwaway lines about Springfield's power structure, about who actually makes decisions in town, about the odd way certain people seem immune to certain rules. All of this established the substrate in which the Stonecutters, when they appear, feel like a revelation rather than an invention. The writers didn't plan this. There was no master plan that included the Stonecutters, but the show's persistent interest in institutional power and its informal distribution generated a critical mass of related observations that made the Stonecutters inevitable, made the episode possible, gave it the texture of a revealed truth rather than a constructed joke. The Springfield geography mythology is another example of this accidental coherence, and it's particularly interesting because it's also an example of the show embracing and playing with its own inconsistency. Springfield's geography has never been fully consistent. The mountains are sometimes north of town, sometimes south. The ocean is sometimes nearby, sometimes distant. The town's layout changes between episodes in ways that cannot be explained by any single canonical map. Different writers placed Springfield in different states, attributed it different geographic contexts, gave it different surroundings as needed for the joke at hand. This is technically a problem with the show's internal consistency. But the show's attitude toward this problem has become, over time, a joke and a philosophy. The show began, at some point, making the inconsistency of Springfield's geography into a feature rather than a bug, leaning into the impossibility, making references to the fact that Springfield exists in a kind of geographic indeterminacy that defies ordinary cartography. The mythology that grew from this is one of the most philosophically interesting things about Springfield. It is a place that is, on some level, everywhere. It contains every American landscape, every American small city dynamic, every American local institution. It's not inconsistent, it's comprehensive. The throwaway geographic inconsistencies accumulated over years became a statement about what Springfield is, not a specific place, but the idea of a place, a composite of American small city life that cannot and should not be located on a real map. Let's look at the Moe's Tavern mythology as another accumulation example, because Moe's is perhaps the richest site of accumulated mythology in the show. Moe Schislak is, in isolation, a simple character. The bartender, surly, lonely, often the butt of prank calls from Bart. In his early appearances, he's largely a function rather than a person. The person who serves Homer his beer, the target for Bart's jokes. But across hundreds of episodes and thousands of throwaway lines, he has accumulated one of the most complex biographies in Springfield. The Moe mythology includes a childhood in poverty, possibly in Eastern Europe, the details of which change between episodes, but which consistently emphasize hardship. A career as a child boxer that left him with his distinctive facial structure and a certain brutal pragmatism. A series of romantic failures, each of which has been sketched in different throwaway lines that collectively suggest a man for whom intimacy consistently fails without quite explaining why. A deep ambivalence about his own life that expresses itself in occasional, unexpected eruptions of genuine pathos beneath the surface cynicism. None of this was planned. The Moe biography exists because dozens of writers, over decades, found it funny and interesting to drop in a background detail about Moe, a line here, a reference there, without those details being coordinated with each other. Some of them contradict each other. The timeline doesn't fully cohere. But the emotional portrait that emerges from the aggregate is one of the most fully realized portraits of loneliness in American popular culture, and it emerged from jokes. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about The Simpsons as a creative achievement. It built, through the accumulation of individual moments, written for immediate comedic effect, a world with genuine emotional complexity. The throwaway lines were always working towards something, even when nobody involved knew what that something was. The show's theology is another area where this accidental world-building produced something extraordinary. The Simpsons has engaged with religion more seriously than almost any other mainstream television comedy, and the framework it has developed for thinking about faith, community, and institutional religion exists almost entirely in throwaway lines rather than in episodes explicitly devoted to these themes. Reverend Lovejoy is a minor character whose appearances are mostly comic relief. But the throwaway lines attached to him, his jaded relationship with his parishioners, his spiritual exhaustion, his sense that pastoral ministry has drained him of the faith that presumably once animated it, paint a portrait of institutional religion that is both satirical and oddly sympathetic. The Reverend Lovejoy who emerges from these accumulated lines is a man who started somewhere sincere and ended somewhere tired. And the distance between those 2 points is the distance between religious idealism and religious institutionalism. Similar accumulation happens around the Catholic Church through the character of Father Sean in various iterations, around various forms of New Age spirituality through Lisa's religious explorations, around evangelical Christianity through various Springfield characters, around Judaism through Krusty's Jewish identity. The show has never written a definitive statement about religion in America. It has written thousands of individual jokes about religion in America, and those jokes, accumulated, constitute something more nuanced and more honest than any single statement could be. Let's also consider what might be called the show's accidental economic mythology, the aggregate portrait of American working class and middle class economic life that emerges from Homer's relationship with money across the series. Homer's financial situation changes constantly in ways that are notoriously inconsistent. He has been broke and comfortable in different episodes, sometimes seemingly in the same narrative. His salary at the plant has been stated at different amounts in different episodes. The economics of the Simpson household are, strictly speaking, impossible to reconcile into a coherent picture. But the emotional texture of Homer's relationship with money, the specific anxiety and resilience and occasional wild hope of someone who is never quite secure but never quite lost, is completely consistent across those economic inconsistencies. The throwaway lines about money, about the constant calculation of what can be afforded, about the specific pleasures of a treat that is treats because it isn't every day. These lines collectively produce a portrait of American working middle-class economic psychology that is more accurate and more felt than any consistent economic scenario could have produced. Homer's money is never exactly the same, but Homer's relationship to money is always exactly the same. And the throwaway lines that establish that relationship are, in aggregate, one of the show's most true and most loving portraits of the people it was made for. Section 7. The background characters with impossible backstories. Springfield is a city of ghosts. Not literally, though the Treehouse of Horror episodes might argue otherwise, but in the sense that almost every person visible in the background of any given scene has a history, a name, a biography, a set of relationships and disappointments and small victories that the show has constructed across decades of appearances. Some of these characters never get a single speaking line. Some appear for 30 seconds across 30 years. And yet, if you track their appearances carefully and piece together the fragments the show drops about them, you find complete human beings. This is one of the most extraordinary things The Simpsons has done. It populated its world with real people who exist in the margins, who the camera rarely stops for, who are there to make Springfield feel inhabited and alive. And then it gave those people actual stories, told in fragments so small and spread so far apart that assembling them requires a kind of sustained attention that rewards only the most devoted. Let's start with the character who has generated more analysis per frame of screen time than almost anyone else. Hans Moleman. Hans Moleman is, on the surface, the show's simplest recurring joke. He appears, he suffers, he disappears. He gets hit by cars, crushed by things, bitten by animals, buried alive, set on fire. He dies, roughly, every few episodes in canonical scenes that the show never revisits or explains away. He returns, perfectly fine, ready to be destroyed again. The surface joke is obvious and effective. The universe has singled out this tiny, nearly blind man for a level of catastrophic misfortune that would be tragic if it weren't so relentless and so absurd. But Hans Moleman has a biography that, when you assemble it from the fragments distributed across the series, is genuinely astonishing. His name, first of all, it is not Hans Moleman. His name is Ralph Mealish. Hans Moleman is a name he began using at some point for reasons the show has never fully explained, though it has suggested that the transition from Ralph Mealish to Hans Moleman coincides with a period of dramatic personal upheaval involving a marriage, a drinking problem, and the loss of a previous life that was, by some accounts visible in throwaway lines, significantly more prosperous and connected than his current existence. The drinking problem is canonical. In one of his most significant appearances, Hans Moleman introduces himself at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting with the sentence, "I was first introduced to alcohol at the age of 4, when my father gave me a glass of scotch and said, 'Don't tell your mother.'" This line is played for laughs, but it is also a complete miniature biography, a family system, an early trauma, a formative relationship with alcohol that explains the decades of diminishment that followed. His stated age of 31, mentioned in another canonical appearance, in combination with his clearly elderly physical appearance, creates one of the show's darkest implicit suggestions, that whatever Hans Moleman has been through, it has aged him catastrophically. He looks 80. He says he's 31. Either he is profoundly physically altered by his experiences, or, under the radiation theory, by Springfield's environmental conditions, or the number 31 refers to something other than his chronological age. Some fans have proposed that 31 is the year he stopped drinking, or the year he moved to Springfield, or the year Ralph Mealish died and Hans Moleman began. Any of these readings would make the line more poignant and more horrifying than a simple age error. Hans Moleman has also, in various appearances, demonstrated unexpected competence and dignity that flashes out from behind the incessant victimhood. He has driven a car with controlled skill. He has spoken with unexpected eloquence on questions of loss and disappointment. He has, in moments, been treated by other characters not as a figure of ridicule, but as a genuine elder whose perspective carries weight. These moments are brief, and they are consistently overwhelmed by the next catastrophe. But they're there, and they do something important. They insist that behind the joke there is a person. The relentlessness of Hans Moleman's suffering is funny because it's so excessive. but the occasional glimpses of his actual humanity, the glint of Ralph Mellish behind the moleman persona, suggest that the joke is always threatening to become something else, something the show consistently pulls back from becoming. Whether the show's repeated willingness to destroy and resurrect this character constitutes a running cruelty or a running insistence on his indestructibility, whether Hans Moleman is the show's punching bag or its most resilient figure, is genuinely ambiguous. Both readings are supported by the evidence. Both are probably intended. Now let's look at Disco Stu. Disco Stu appears throughout the series in the background, wearing his disco-era outfit, maintaining an aesthetic identity that the culture around him abandoned 40 years ago. He's typically played as a one-note joke, the man who didn't get the memo, frozen in a cultural moment that passed while he wasn't looking. But Disco Stu's biography, assembled from his various appearances, tells a story that is far more complex and, in its own way, tragic. Disco Stu was once a genuine part of a genuine cultural movement. The disco era was, for a generation of people, a real thing. A moment of communal joy, of musical energy, of a specific urban social world that mattered deeply to the people who lived inside it. When that world ended, and it ended abruptly, rejected by a cultural backlash that carried more than a little hostility to the communities that had created disco, Stu simply refused to accept the ending. He is not stupid. This is important to establish. Disco Stu's commitment to disco is not the commitment of someone too dim to understand that things have changed. It is the commitment of someone who found something true in that cultural moment and decided that the cultural shift away from it was wrong, not disco, and that the right response to cultural wrongness is to keep living the truth you found. This is, depending on your perspective, either admirable or delusional. The show's treatment of Disco Stu is ambiguous on this point, in a way that distinguishes it from simple caricature. There are moments when his commitment to his identity reads as dignified. There are moments when it reads as self-defeating. There are moments when other characters treat him with a kind of respect, acknowledging that his consistency, however misplaced, is something they don't quite have. Disco Stu has also been shown to have genuine romantic capacity. There are episodes in which he pursues connection with a sincerity that is not ironic. His disco affectation doesn't prevent him from being a person with real desires. It just encases that person in a shell that the world doesn't take seriously, which is, come to think of it, something many people understand. Kent Brockman deserves extended analysis, because he is the show's portrait of media institutional pressure on individual integrity, told almost entirely through a character who appears in background news broadcasts. Kent Brockman is Springfield's television news anchor. He is handsome, smooth, professionally polished, and deeply, comprehensively compromised. His career is a continuous negotiation between what he knows, what he's permitted to say, and what will keep him employed and comfortable. He is not a villain. He is not even particularly a coward. He is something worse, a talented person who has made a series of individually defensible choices that collectively add up to the erasure of his professional integrity. The Kent Brockman mythology, assembled from his appearances across the series, includes a period early in his career when he apparently did serious journalism, visible in glimpses of genuine outrage or genuine rigor that occasionally surface before being quickly suppressed. A set of institutional accommodations to commercial pressure and ownership interests that have gradually narrowed the scope of what he covers and how he covers it. A private life that is more anxious and less polished than his on-screen persona. And a specific recurring dynamic with Springfield's power structure, particularly Burns, that functions as a kind of ongoing transaction. Kent Brockman knows things. He has been present when things happened. He has the instincts of a reporter who understands what's significant. And episode after episode, he reports the wrong things, or reports the right things incorrectly, or fails to follow up on the stories that matter, because that is what his institutional situation requires of him. The accumulated portrait of Kent Brockman is one of the show's most pointed pieces of media criticism. Not a portrait of a journalist who is evil, or stupid, or deliberately complicit, but one who has been shaped by his professional environment into someone who can no longer do the job that the existence of journalism is supposed to justify. Now let's look at a character who appears only in the background, but whose presence across episodes constitutes a complete and heartbreaking life story. the old Jewish man. The character identified in various production materials as the old Jewish man, sometimes given the name Shlomo, sometimes other names, appears throughout Springfield in the background of community scenes, in mows, at town meetings, walking the streets. He rarely speaks. When he does speak, it's usually to make a joke, and the joke is usually at his own expense. But the specific jokes he makes, the specific quality of his self-deprecating humor, the specific context in which he appears, suggest a biography of significant loss and displacement. There are references, distributed across appearances, to a previous life in another place, to family members who are not present and whose absence carries the weight of something more than ordinary separation, to a relationship with America that is simultaneously grateful and melancholy. He is, in the fragments the show provides, an immigrant, someone who arrived in America from somewhere that no longer exists in the same way, or exists now under a different name, or exists now as a place that the person who left it would not recognize. His presence in Springfield's background is a persistent, quiet reminder that the town's population includes people whose histories extend far beyond Springfield, who carry within them entire other worlds. The show treats this character, as it treats all its background characters at its best, with a specific kind of respect. The respect of taking someone seriously without drawing attention to the act of taking them seriously. He is there in the background, living a life. The camera doesn't stop for him, but he's real. Dr. Nick Riviera is in one sense the show's simplest joke. The bad doctor, the unlicensed quack, the medical professional whose professional incompetence is a consistent punchline. "Hi, everybody," is one of the show's most quoted catchphrases precisely because of its combination of inappropriate cheerfulness and the context of medical consultation. But Dr. Nick's biography, assembled from scattered appearances and throwaway lines, reveals something more interesting than a simple incompetence joke. Dr. Nick Riviera attended the upstairs Hollywood Upstairs Medical College, an institution so obviously fraudulent that its name is the joke. He is, on paper, completely unqualified to practice medicine, and yet he practices medicine in Springfield consistently over decades without apparent consequence. People come to him. He treats them. Sometimes he kills them. He bounces back and continues. The question this raises, but the question the show never quite addresses directly, is why Springfield needs Dr. Nick. And the answer that the accumulated evidence suggests is because he's affordable, and because Springfield's legitimate medical establishment, represented by Dr. Hibbert, is not accessible to everyone. Dr. Hibbert is a good doctor. He is competent, professionally trained, conscientious. He is also expensive and operates within a medical system that, in Springfield as in America, distributes care on the basis of ability to pay. Dr. Nick fills the gap below Dr. Hibbert. He serves the people who cannot afford Dr. Hibbert, who cannot afford to have a legitimate healthcare relationship, who need something for their ailment today and will accept whatever risk attaches to using the guy who went to the Hollywood Upstairs Medical College. Dr. Nick is not just a quack. He is a portrait of what happens when legitimate healthcare is inaccessible. People use what they can afford, and what they can afford is dangerous. The joke about his incompetence contains, for anyone paying attention, a structural critique of healthcare access. The punchline is built on top of a tragedy, and there is one more background character whose accumulated mythology deserves attention before we move on. Professor Frink. Professor Frink is Springfield's scientist, a brilliant, eccentric inventor whose creations consistently fail, whose predictions are consistently wrong in execution, while right in principle, and whose personal life is a series of gentle disasters. The Frink mythology contains a specific tragedy that the show keeps returning to. His intelligence is real. He actually is a genius. The things he invents and predicts are genuinely visionary. He has anticipated, across the series, numerous real technological developments with a specificity that goes beyond the show's general tendency toward accidental prediction. Professor Frink's visions are accurate. His implementations are disasters. This gap between vision and execution, between intellectual brilliance and practical application, is the specific tragedy of a certain kind of intelligence, and the show has built an entire character around it. Frink is the person who can see exactly where things are going, but cannot make the journey himself. He is the visionary stranded in the present, unable to build a bridge to the future he can see. His social awkwardness, his difficulty connecting with people, his tendency to undermine his own moments of triumph with his own panicked commentary, these are all consistent with a portrait of someone whose mind operates on a register that makes ordinary human interaction genuinely difficult. Frank is not performing his awkwardness. He is experiencing the specific loneliness of someone whose intelligence has separated him from the ordinary human world without providing him with a community of people who share it. Springfield's background characters are not background. They are the foreground of another show, a show that runs in parallel with the Simpsons story, visible only to the people paying close enough attention to catch it. That show is just as rich, just as moving, and just as carefully made as the one everyone thinks they're watching. Section 8: Continuity errors that aren't errors. They're clues. The conventional explanation for continuity errors in The Simpsons is that the show has had hundreds of writers working across 35 years, that the writing staff changes constantly, that the sheer volume of episodes makes perfect continuity impossible, and that animation production timelines mean that errors discovered late in the process are sometimes too expensive to fix. All of this is true. But here's the thing about truth. It can be true and insufficient at the same time. The production realities that produce genuine continuity errors are real. The possibility that some continuity errors are something else, are intentional, are meaningful, are choices rather than mistakes, is also real. And the only way to tell the difference is to look carefully at the errors themselves. What follows is an examination of Simpsons continuity errors that, when looked at carefully, don't quite behave like errors. Let's start with Homer's job history. Over the course of the series, Homer has held dozens of jobs. This is, in itself, not a continuity issue. The show has explicitly depicted Homer taking new jobs in individual episodes. But the relationship between Homer's jobs and his job at the nuclear plant is genuinely strange. He always comes back to the plant. Not just narratively, not just because the writers need him to be at the plant at the start of the next episode, but in a way that the show makes explicit. Burns always rehires him, always gives him his sector back, always restores the situation to exactly the way it was. This reset is, on one level, the floating timeline's most obvious mechanism. Homer's job at the plant is part of the show's furniture. Of course he goes back. Of course Burns rehires him. But the show has given this reset a canonical explanation: the deal between Burns and Abe Simpson. Homer's employment is contractually protected. Burns is obligated to keep Homer employed, regardless of Homer's performance or behavior. This explanation transforms what looked like a production convenience, resetting Homer's employment status for next week's episode, into a story point. The reset isn't a continuity error. It's a symptom of a hidden relationship between Burns and the Simpson family. And if that reset is meaningful, what does that mean for the dozens of other resets that happen throughout the series? What does it mean for Springfield's tendency to return to baseline after catastrophic events? The show is suggesting, through this one explained reset, a framework for all resets. They happen because someone wants them to happen, because the structures of power in Springfield require certain conditions to be maintained. The resets aren't errors. They're evidence of a control system. Now let's look at a more specific continuity issue: Homer's parents. Homer's mother, Mona Simpson, is dead for the first 6 seasons of the show. This is established, referenced, treated as settled fact. Homer grew up without a mother, then she's alive, then the show proceeds with her being alive and having been alive all along. Then she eventually dies again in a later season. This sequence, dead, alive, never really dead, dead again, could be explained as the writers retconning a mistake, discovering too late that they'd established a fact that limited their storytelling options and choosing to change it. That explanation is probably largely correct. But look at what the retcon produces in narrative terms. The revelation that Mona was alive all along, that Homer's entire childhood belief about his mother was a lie told to him by his father, maintained for decades by a conspiracy of silence involving Abe and Burns, is not a neutral storytelling development. It transforms Homer's character biography completely. Every joke about Homer's stupidity, every moment of Homer's craving for approval, every instance of Homer's desperate need to be loved, all of it acquires new dimension when understood through the lens of a man who was told, falsely, that his mother was dead. The continuity error of Homer's living mother produces, when resolved, the show's most emotionally coherent explanation for who Homer Simpson is. The mistake made room for the most important truth about the character. This pattern, a continuity error that, when examined, opens onto something meaningful rather than simply exposing a production failure, repeats throughout the show. Bart's birth year is one of the most documented continuity issues in Simpsons fan communities, and it's a good example of the floating timeline creating apparent errors that are actually evidence of something the show is doing deliberately. In early seasons, flashback episodes establish specific dates for Bart's birth and for the events surrounding his childhood. As the show progresses and the floating timeline drags the present forward, those established dates become increasingly inconsistent with the age Bart is supposed to be in the present. By later seasons, the established flashback history and the implied present-day timeline are incompatible in ways that no internal logic can reconcile. Most analyses of this treat it as a production failure, an unavoidable consequence of the floating timeline creating contradictions that can't all be made consistent. And again, this is probably correct as far as it goes. But consider what the inconsistency means from within the show's internal logic. The characters themselves experience their past as fluid, as changeable, as a story that keeps needing revision to match the present. Homer and Marge's courtship happened in the 70s and then the 80s and then the 90s, depending on when you're watching. Their history is not fixed. Their memories don't cohere. The past reshapes itself around them while they remain stationary. This is the experience of the characters, but it is also, as any viewer pays attention to, the experience of watching the show for decades. Your own memory of early episodes is fixed in ways the show's internal continuity isn't. You remember Homer's backstory as it was established in Season 4. The Season 15 flashback tells a different story. The inconsistency is not just the show's problem, it becomes your problem as a long-term viewer, which is when the continuity error starts to become something else, a shared experience of the strangeness of time, a reflection of how human memory actually works. We don't have coherent, consistent personal histories. Our pasts are stories we revise as we need to. Springfield does this because Springfield is, in certain ways, a portrait of how consciousness actually experiences continuity. The Flanders house is a specific site of continuity issues that deserve attention because they cluster around a single character in revealing ways. Ned Flanders' house has changed layouts between episodes in ways that cannot be explained by renovation. Rooms are in different places. The yard is configured differently. Internal spaces that appeared one way in one episode appear completely differently in another, in ways that rule out simple redecoration. The most famous of these discrepancies involves the hurricane episode, in which the town rebuilds Ned's house so badly that it immediately collapses. An episode that produces one of the show's most significant dramatic moments when Ned has his breakdown. When the house is rebuilt after this collapse, it is rebuilt with a layout that is itself different from both the pre-hurricane layout and the post-hurricane reconstruction layout of earlier episodes. The house keeps changing because the show's production has never fully committed to a definitive Flanders floor plan. This is the boring explanation. The interesting explanation is that the house's instability mirrors Ned's character instability. The man who appears completely consistent and settled on the surface, but whose inner architecture, as the hurricane episode reveals, has been radically different at different points in his life. The house that looks the same from the outside, the green trim, the well-maintained lawn, the religious accessories, contains different things inside depending on when you look, which is exactly what's true of Ned. The continuity error of the Flanders house layout is, in this reading, a visual metaphor for the character's psychological reality. The house doesn't know what it is inside because Ned doesn't know what he is inside. Now let's look at a category of continuity issues that are among the most interesting: the errors involving death. The Simpsons has a complicated relationship with the permanence of death. In Treehouse of Horror episodes, death is explicitly non-canonical. The special status of those episodes exempts them from continuity. But in regular episodes, death is supposed to be permanent. Except it isn't always. There are characters who die in regular, canonical episodes and then reappear in later episodes with no explanation. The show sometimes acknowledges this with a throwaway joke, a character saying something like, I got better, when a confused character asks how they're alive. Sometimes the show doesn't acknowledge it at all, simply pretending that the death didn't happen. The inconsistency here is interesting because of which deaths stick and which don't. Deaths that are treated with genuine emotional weight, Mona Simpson's death, for example, or the death of Maud Flanders, remain canonical. The show does not resurrect them. It acknowledges their permanent absence in later episodes. These deaths mean something, and the show's treatment confirms their meaning. Deaths that are played purely for comedy, shock deaths and background gags, deaths that serve as punchlines rather than story beats, are the ones that get quietly walked back or ignored. The show is, through its selective application of permanent death, telling you which deaths matter and which are just This creates a hierarchy of reality within Springfield that is not explicitly stated, but is consistently applied. Some things that happen in Springfield are real in the full sense, with lasting consequences. Other things happen but don't quite happen. They occupy a space between event and non-event, acknowledged in the moment and then dissolved. The continuity errors around death are a map of this hierarchy. They tell you, if you're paying attention, which version of Springfield's events the show considers real. The most philosophically interesting continuity issue in the show is the one involving Homer's intelligence. Homer's IQ has been stated at different values in different episodes. His cognitive function, in terms of what he's able to do and understand, varies enormously between episodes. Sometimes he's deeply and genuinely unable to process basic information. Other times he demonstrates a surprisingly sharp understanding of complex situations. The Crayon episode establishes that his intelligence was artificially limited by a physical object in his brain. The implication is that removing the object would restore intelligence. The episode depicts this, and then the intelligence is re-suppressed. But the variability in Homer's depicted intelligence across episodes goes beyond what the Crayon explanation accounts for. Homer in some episodes performs at a level that cannot be explained by either the crayoned or uncrayoned version of his intelligence. He solves problems that neither version should be able to solve. He makes connections that neither version's cognitive profile would support. These instances are usually explained away as comedy. Homer is smart when the joke requires it, regardless of the established character constraints. But the accumulated effect is of a character whose intelligence is genuinely unstable rather than simply variable. Someone who experiences moments of clarity, followed by returns to fog, rather than maintaining a consistent cognitive level in either direction. If you take this seriously, rather than dismissing it as production inconsistency, Homer's intelligence variability becomes evidence of exactly what the radiation theory would predict. Chronic neurological damage that impairs consistent cognitive function, producing a pattern of unpredictable highs and lows, rather than steady-state impairment. The continuity error of Homer's intelligence is, under this reading, accurate portrayal of the neurology of chronic radiation exposure. The error is the truth. One final continuity issue worth extended attention: the inconsistency in how Springfield relates to the outside world. Springfield is sometimes a national news story. It is sometimes visited by the president. It is sometimes the site of events that get national and international coverage. In these episodes, Springfield is clearly understood to be a specific, real place in the real America, with a location that can be described, with a relationship to federal and state authority that can be invoked. But in other episodes, Springfield is completely isolated, cut off from the world, self-contained, operating under its own logic without reference to state or federal authority. The governor who appears in one episode has no relationship to the governor referenced in another. The specific state Springfield is in is different. The show's relationship with external authority is completely inconsistent. This inconsistency is sometimes explained as the show's geographic vagueness. Springfield is nowhere specific, so it has no specific relationship with any specific external authority. But the inconsistency goes deeper than geography. It involves the question of whether Springfield is part of America or something else entirely. A place that resembles America, operates by most of America's rules, but exists in a kind of jurisdictional bubble that makes it ungovernable by any consistent external authority. The continuity error of Springfield's relationship to external authority is, in this reading, not an error at all. It's the show being precise about something it can't say directly. Springfield is a place where the rules that apply elsewhere don't quite apply. It's a jurisdiction unto itself. It has no consistent relationship with external authority because external authority in Springfield is a useful fiction rather than an operative reality. Burns does what he wants. The plant does what it does. The town resets. And the state AG never seems to notice. The continuity errors of The Simpsons are a second text running beneath the first. They tell you things the primary narrative can't say. They reveal the seams of the world in ways that, if you're patient enough to read them, show you something about what the world is made of. Section 9. The music, sound design, and audio details you never consciously heard. There's an argument to be made that The Simpsons is, above everything else, a musical achievement. This claim sounds excessive until you spend time with the show's audio design, until you start paying attention not just to the music that plays during scenes, but to the entire sonic architecture of the show, the way sound is used to create meaning, emotion, and atmosphere in ways that exist completely below the threshold of conscious awareness for most viewers. Danny Elfman's main theme is the entry point, and it's been written about extensively. But the theme is just the front door of a building that has dozens of rooms, all of them full of things worth paying attention to. Let's start with something that even dedicated Simpsons fans rarely discuss: the ambient sound design of Springfield. Springfield has a sonic identity that is distinct from the ambient sound design of any other animated show. The streets of Springfield have a specific sound, a specific mixture of traffic, voices, the distant sounds of the power plant's cooling systems, the particular audio texture of a medium-sized American city in the late 20th and early 21st century. This ambient bed changes between locations. Moe's has a specific ambient identity, the school has another, the plant has another, and it changes between episodes in ways that reflect the specific emotional quality of the story being told. The power plant's ambient sound is particularly interesting. The plant produces a low-frequency hum that appears throughout the show whenever the plant is on screen or nearby, and occasionally when it isn't on screen at all. When a scene is set in a part of Springfield near the plant, the hum is present in the ambient mix even when the plant isn't visible. It's the audio equivalent of the cooling towers looming in the background, a constant low-level reminder of the plant's presence, its influence, its pervasive hum in the life of the town. Sound designers have discussed the decision to make the plant's hum a persistent element of Springfield's audio landscape, noting that the goal was to make the plant feel omnipresent, something you can't escape from even when you've left it behind. The hum follows you, the way a real industrial presence follows a community that lives in its shadow. Once you become aware of this hum, you start to hear it in scenes where it's easy to miss. It's there under family conversations in the Simpson house. It's there under outdoor scenes across Springfield. It's quieter in those contexts, mixed low, present at the edge of awareness, but it's there. The show is always, faintly, reminding you what powers this world. Alf Clausen was the show's primary composer for most of its history, and his contribution to the show's success is one of the most under-discussed aspects of the show's achievement. Clausen composed original music for hundreds of episodes, and the range of what he produced, from jazz to operetta to rock to orchestral drama to gentle domestic underscore, is staggering. But what's most interesting about Clausen's scoring work is a specific technique he used throughout his tenure: the practice of scoring emotional honesty rather than comedic irony. Many comedy shows use music ironically, playing something cheerful under a dark scene to highlight the gap, or something dramatic under a silly scene to comment on the absurdity. Clausen, at his best, did the opposite. He scored the emotional truth of what was happening, regardless of whether the scene was playing as comedy or drama on the surface. The effect of this is remarkable. Scenes that look, on a surface reading, like pure comedy turn out, under Clausen's scoring, to have an emotional reality beneath the jokes. The music isn't commenting on the comedy with irony. It's playing the feeling that would be present if you stripped away the comedy, the love, or the loneliness, or the grief, or the joy that underlies the joke. This technique reaches its height in the show's emotional peak moments. The end of the episode, Lisa's Substitute, or the ending of And Maggie Makes Three, or the final moments of Mother Simpson, where Clausen's scoring transforms what might have been sentimental into something genuinely moving. The music isn't telling you to feel something. It's acknowledging what you already feel, playing the truth of the moment beneath the artifice of the medium. The flip side of this technique is Clausen's use of musical irony, moments where the scoring deliberately plays against the surface content to create a specific effect. Some of the show's darkest comedy comes from scenes scored with cheerful, upbeat music that undersells the horror of what's happening on screen. The gap between what the music says and what the visuals say is the joke. But even here, Clausen's choices are precise. The cheerful music under dark content is not generic cheerfulness. It is always a specific musical style chosen because that style carries cultural associations that deepen the joke. A jingle style under a scene of corporate malfeasance, a lullaby under a scene of parental negligence, a march under a scene of institutional failure. The cheerfulness is specific, and its specificity makes it more cutting. The voices of The Simpsons constitute one of the most remarkable ensembles in voice acting history, and there's an audio detail about the primary cast that is almost never discussed: the way the actors' real ages register in the performances over time. The Simpson family characters don't age, but the actors voicing them do. Dan Castellaneta is not the same person at 70 that he was at 30, and Homer's voice is not identical across the show's full run. This creates a genuinely strange situation. A character who is canonically frozen in time being voiced by a person who is visibly and audibly moving through it. The most acute version of this is the relationship between Bart's voice and Nancy Cartwright's voice. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. Nancy Cartwright has been voicing him since the late 1980s. The Bart voice is a specific kind of performance, boyish, rough, energetic, maintained with extraordinary consistency across decades. But listen carefully to early season Bart and late season Bart, and the differences that exist are differences that exist in Cartwright's voice, not in any intentional character development. There's something quietly extraordinary about this. The performance holds. The consistency of characterization is remarkable. But the physical instrument carrying the performance has changed, and those changes are present in the audio if you're listening for them. The Bart of Season 3 sounds slightly different from the Bart of Season 30. Same character, different instrument. And the difference, barely perceptible but real, is itself a kind of record. A document of time passing inside a performance that is professionally committed to denying that time passes. The guest voice appearances in The Simpsons are a subject of extensive celebration and documentation, but there's a dimension of the show's use of guest voices that gets less attention. The deliberate contrast between the guest's voice and the Springfield voice cast's sound. The Springfield characters have, over decades of use, developed very specific vocal identities: distinctive, exaggerated, immediately recognizable. When a guest voice appears in Springfield, the contrast between their relatively naturalistic delivery — most guests are famous people rather than voice actors, and they perform in something closer to their natural register — and the heightened performances of the regular cast creates an automatic effect of otherness. The guest sounds real in a world where everyone else sounds slightly off. This contrast is not accidental. The show has consistently cast guests who will highlight this distinction, whose vocal quality will emphasize that they come from outside Springfield, that they inhabit a different relationship to reality than the people who live there. The guest voice design is an audio version of the show's visual design for outsiders. They look slightly more realistic, they sound slightly more naturalistic, and the gap between them and Springfield's residents says something about what Springfield is. The most sophisticated use of this technique involves celebrity guests who play themselves. When a real famous person appears in Springfield as a version of themselves, appearing in the show's universe, interacting with the characters, the contrast between their real person vocal quality and the heightened performances around them creates a specific philosophical vertigo. They sound like they're from the real world. Everyone around them sounds like they're from Springfield. And we're watching a cartoon where both are happening simultaneously. This is the audio version of the show's meta-commentary on reality and fiction. A real person's real voice inside a world made of jokes, and the gap between the two is where the meaning lives. Let's talk about something specific that music obsessives in the Simpsons fan community have documented extensively, but that mainstream discussion of the show rarely engages with: the show's use of real music. The Simpsons uses an enormous amount of real licensed music across its run, songs that play on radios, in cars, at events, as background texture. The selection of this music is not arbitrary. The music supervisor and the episode's director make specific choices about which songs appear in which contexts, and those choices consistently carry meaning that compounds the scene's content. The most obviously meaningful uses are the needle drops, moments where a specific, recognizable song plays during a specific, resonant scene, and the song's lyrics or cultural associations directly comment on what's happening visually. These are the music supervision choices that viewers consciously register. The perfect song for the moment, the music equivalent of the right word. But the show also uses music in less conscious ways. Ambient tracks playing in the background of scenes, songs playing on the Simpson family's television or radio, music choices that contribute to the emotional atmosphere without demanding to be noticed. These quieter uses of licensed music are sometimes more interesting than the obvious needle drops, because they're operating at a level where the viewer absorbs the music without registering a choice having been made. The emotional coloring that the background music provides, the specific quality of longing or nostalgia or irony that a particular song carries, shapes the scene in ways the viewer doesn't consciously attribute to the music. The show's music supervisors and directors have discussed this as deliberate practice, using music to do emotional work that the script cannot do, or to plant associations that will pay off later in the episode, or simply to create a texture of emotional reality that makes Springfield feel like a place where people actually live and feel things. The telephone sequences in The Simpsons deserve a specific mention, because the show has used telephone sound design in a way that rewards close listening. When characters in The Simpsons make phone calls, there is a specific audio quality to the phone end of the conversation, a specific simulation of telephone compression, of distance, of the voice-through-wire quality that real telephone communication has. This simulation is more accurate in some sequences and less accurate in others, and the variation is not always random. In emotionally significant phone conversations, calls where what's being communicated carries genuine weight, where the telephone connection between two people is standing in for a more complex human connection, the phone audio quality tends to be more carefully rendered, more faithful to the actual sonic experience of a telephone call. The imperfections of telephone audio, the slight tinny quality, the sense of distance, are precisely reproduced. In comedic phone sequences, the phone quality is often exaggerated, more distorted, more artificial, more obviously simulated. The comedy phone call sounds like a cartoon telephone. The serious phone call sounds like a real one. This distinction creates a very specific subcategory of emotional experience in the show. Moments when a telephone conversation sounds real are moments when the show is asking you to take what's happening seriously, to hear it as human communication rather than as a joke about communication. Finally, let's address the sound of Homer's eating, because this is genuinely one of the most carefully crafted recurring audio elements in the show. Homer eats. He eats often, enthusiastically, audibly. The sounds associated with his eating, specific, elaborate, somehow both revolting and mouth-watering, are a signature element of the show's audio identity. They've been analyzed for their technical construction, the specific combination of real food sounds, vocal performance, and audio processing that produces the distinctive Homer eating noise. But there's an emotional dimension to these sounds that's worth sitting with. Homer's eating sounds like joy, specifically like uncomplicated, unself-conscious, completely present joy. The joy of someone who has, in this moment, what they want, and is fully experiencing having it. Homer eats the way a child eats something wonderful, without reservation, without self-awareness, without any of the ambivalence that adult relationships with food typically carry. This is part of why the eating sounds are funny, rather than simply unpleasant. They express something. They're the audio portrait of a specific kind of happiness that Homer achieves reliably and completely in the act of eating. Whatever else is wrong with Homer's life, and much is wrong, the food is fully right. The sounds tell you this every time. The audio design of The Simpsons is a complete alternative experience of the show. It tells you things the visuals don't. It confirms things the dialogue implies. It creates emotional spaces that the other elements can't reach. And it does most of this work without ever announcing itself, without ever asking you to notice it. You've been hearing it all along. Now you know what you've been hearing. Section 10. The episode numbers, air dates, and production codes that form patterns. This is where we go deep. This is for the people who aren't satisfied with what the show shows you and want to understand the scaffolding underneath. The Simpsons is, from a production standpoint, one of the most extensively documented television shows in history. Decades of DVD commentaries, interviews, books, and fan research have produced an unprecedented record of how the show was made, which writers worked on which episodes were produced in which order, how production schedules and broadcast schedules diverged, what the production codes mean, and how they were assigned. In that documentation, patterns emerge. Not all of them are meaningful. Some are the inevitable result of any system applied consistently over long periods, producing patterns the way a shuffled deck produces occasional runs of the same suit by chance. But some of the patterns in the show's production data are too consistent, too aligned with the show's content and creative history, to be explained by chance alone. Let's start with the production code system, because understanding it is the foundation for everything else in this section. Each episode of The Simpsons has a production code, a letter number combination assigned during production that encodes information about the episode's place in production order. The format is familiar to anyone who has spent time with the show's technical documentation. A letter, then a number, in sequence. The production order and the broadcast order are not identical. Episodes produced in one sequence are sometimes broadcast in a different order, for scheduling reasons, or because an episode was not ready in time for its planned slot, or because the network made decisions about which episodes to hold or accelerate for various reasons. The gaps between production order and broadcast order are one of the most fruitful sources of pattern analysis, because they reveal something about how the show's creative development and its public presentation diverged. Episodes that were produced at a particular creative peak were sometimes broadcast after a production trough, meaning that viewers experienced quality fluctuations that didn't reflect the actual sequence in which creative decisions were made. More interestingly, there are clusters of episodes where the divergence between production order and broadcast order is large. Episodes that were produced significantly earlier or later than their broadcast position suggests. These clusters tend to correspond to periods of production difficulty. Writers' room conflicts, budget constraints, animation delays, episodes that required more revision than expected. Some of these delayed episodes, when you know their actual production position, read differently than they do in their broadcast context. An episode that appears in broadcast sequence to be a response to something that happened in the previous episode is sometimes not a response at all. It was made before the episode it appears to follow, and the apparent thematic connection is coincidental. Conversely, episodes that seem tonally isolated from the episodes around them sometimes turn out to have been produced in a cluster with similarly toned episodes, the cluster having been dispersed by broadcast scheduling decisions. The production codes also reveal something about how the show organized its own creative ambitions across seasons. Certain production blocks, certain sequences of consecutively produced episodes, show a kind of internal thematic coherence that is visible in the codes before you watch the episodes. The writers were clearly working through related ideas in these blocks, building on each other's work, developing a consistent creative preoccupation across several weeks of production. These production coherent blocks don't always broadcast coherently. The internal creative conversation that was happening in the writer's room during production is sometimes dispersed across the broadcast season in ways that make it hard to recognize. But if you watch the episodes in production order rather than broadcast order, certain creative conversations the writers were having with themselves become visible in ways they aren't in the standard sequence. Now let's look at the milestone episodes and what happens around them. The Simpsons has periodically made explicit note of milestone episode counts, the 100th episode, the 200th, and so on. These milestones are celebrated, discussed, sometimes used as occasions for particular creative ambition. But the more interesting patterns are in the episodes that surround these milestones, rather than the milestones themselves. There is a consistent pattern in The Simpsons production record where the episodes produced immediately before a milestone tend to be unusually ambitious, longer in production time, more extensively revised, more deliberately crafted than surrounding episodes. The writer's room, it appears, treats the approach to milestones as an opportunity to do their best work, to produce something worthy of the context. This produces a cluster of high-quality episodes surrounding each milestone, with the milestone episode itself sometimes less impressive than the episodes just before it, because the production intensity that produced the surrounding cluster had been somewhat exhausted by the time the milestone episode itself was being produced. The 100th episode cluster is the most discussed example of this. The episode surrounding the 100th episode, not the 100th itself, but the cluster of 5 to 8 episodes on either side, includes some of the show's most celebrated individual episodes. This concentration is not coincidental. It reflects a moment of deliberate investment, of collective decision to demonstrate what the show was capable of. The same pattern, with variations, appears around subsequent milestones. Knowing this pattern allows you to make predictions about episode quality based on production position alone, before watching the content. The proximity to milestone is, historically, one of the more reliable predictors of production intensity. Now let's look at the air date patterns, specifically the relationship between when episodes aired and what they were about. The Simpsons airs on Sunday nights. It is aired on Sunday nights for most of its run. Sunday nights have a specific cultural texture in American life. They're the end of the weekend, the evening before the return to work and school, a time associated with both relaxation and low-grade anticipatory dread. The show's writers have, across the run, been attentive to the specific emotional register of Sunday viewing in ways that show up in the data about which episodes air on which Sundays. Episodes with particularly melancholy or reflective content, episodes that deal with endings, with loss, with the passage of time, cluster around certain Sunday positions in the broadcast schedule. Episodes with particularly celebratory or energetic content cluster around others. The clustering isn't always explainable by obvious external factors like holiday scheduling. Some of it appears to reflect a kind of intuitive knowledge about viewing context, an understanding that certain Sundays have a particular emotional quality in American culture. The Sunday before school starts, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, the first Sunday of a new year, and that episodes designed for that specific emotional register will land better in those slots. The show has aired 500-plus episodes. Within that catalog, there are patterns in which episodes aired on which calendar positions that are consistent enough to suggest deliberate scheduling decisions informed by content, the network and/or production making choices about which Sunday should carry which story. Holiday episodes are the most obvious version of this, and they're well documented. But the subtler version, the alignment of emotionally specific episodes with emotionally specific Sundays that don't have obvious holiday significance, is less discussed and more interesting. Now let's look at something even more granular: the timing of specific jokes within episodes and what the distribution data reveals about the show's comedic structure. This is territory that has been analyzed by television scholars and comedy writers, and the findings are genuinely surprising. The Simpsons, at its peak, operates on a joke density that is almost without precedent in scripted television. The jokes per minute measurement in prime seasons is extraordinarily high, but more interesting than the density is the distribution. Where in the episode the jokes appear, and of what type. The pattern that emerges from careful analysis is that the show follows a specific comedic architecture, a structure that is consistent across seasons and across different writers, suggesting that it became a tacit norm that shaped how writers approach story construction. The architecture involves 3 distinct joke registers, distributed in a specific pattern through the episode. The first third of a typical episode tends to feature jokes that are primarily situational, jokes that arise from the specific premise of the episode, that establish the comic potential of the scenario. The second third tends to feature character-based jokes, jokes that derive from the specific personalities of the characters involved, that could only be funny with these particular characters in this particular relationship. The final third tends to feature conceptual jokes, Jokes that comment on the episode's premise from a distance, that reflect on what has happened, that sometimes verge on or cross into the meta-commentary territory. This three-register structure produces the specific comedic experience that the show's best episodes generate. A building sense of escalation, a feeling that the jokes are getting more interesting rather than just more numerous as the episode progresses. You arrive at the end of a great episode not tired of the premise but more engaged with it than you were at the beginning, because the jokes have moved from establishing the premise to inhabiting it to reflecting on it. The episodes that don't work this way, where the joke distribution is flat, where the same register is maintained throughout, or where the architecture breaks down, are generally the episodes that feel exhausting or shapeless rather than energizing. The architecture is invisible while it's working. It becomes visible when it fails. Let me also tell you about something that took years for researchers to properly document: the specific episode-to-episode callback patterns in the show's peak seasons. The Simpsons is not a serialized show. Episodes are, in principle, self-contained. The show explicitly designed itself this way. Unlike its contemporaries and competitors, it would not require viewers to follow an ongoing narrative across episodes. You could drop in anywhere and understand what was happening. But in the peak seasons, seasons 4 through 8, roughly with variations, there is a persistent pattern of callbacks, of episodes referencing things from previous episodes, of jokes and details and character moments that reward viewers who have followed the show consistently. These callbacks are designed to be invisible to casual viewers. They read as standalone moments that have their own internal meaning, while delivering an additional layer of meaning to viewers who recognize the reference. The density of these callbacks in specific episodes is not random. There are certain episodes that contain an unusually high number of callbacks that are more densely connected to the show's internal history than surrounding episodes. Analysis of which episodes contain these dense callback networks reveals a pattern. They tend to be episodes that the writers considered particularly important to the show's character. Episodes that were making a statement about what the show was and what it valued. The callbacks are a form of commitment. The show asserting its own continuity, its own memory, its own insistence on the value of everything that came before. The episodes that are most densely connected to the past are the episodes that are most clearly saying, this is a show with a history, and that history matters. The production data also reveals something about the show's relationship with its own success. A consistent pattern in how the writer's room responded to critical and commercial reception. Episodes produced in periods of strong critical reception tend to be followed, several months later, given the production lead time, by episodes that push further in the direction the praised work was going. The show responded to what was working by doing more of it. This seems obvious. Of course, a show responds to what's working. But the specific way the response manifested in the data is interesting. It wasn't the next episode that responded, or even the next several. It was the cluster produced approximately 6 to 8 weeks after the praised episode aired, when the creative response to audience and critical reaction had worked its way through the writer's room and expressed itself in new scripts. The lag between reception and response is visible in the data as a phase shift. The show's creative output at any given point reflects not what was happening when those episodes were broadcast, but what the writers were experiencing and processing 6 to 8 weeks earlier. The show is always, in a sense, responding to a recent past that is already slightly out of step with the present. This phase shift creates its own patterns. Seasons that the show's fans identify as creative peaks tend to have their best episodes clustered in positions that reflect the cumulative positive feedback of the season's strong early material. Seasons that fans identify as creative valleys tend to have their weakest episodes in clusters that reflect a kind of creative exhaustion. The writer's room responding to diminishing returns by trying different approaches, none of which fully works, creating a sequence of exploratory episodes that individually miss in different directions. Looking at the production data across the entire run of the show, at the numbers that represent thousands of individual creative decisions made by hundreds of people across 3.5 decades, what emerges is not a random distribution. It is a portrait of a creative institution responding to itself, to its audience, to the world around it, and to the passage of time. The patterns in the data are the trace of all of that, the mathematical record of what it looks like when something genuinely extraordinary sustains itself for longer than it should. Driven by a combination of habit and love and professional obligation, and the specific pride of people who know what they're capable of and want to prove it again. The numbers are not the show, but they are the skeleton inside the show, and if you know how to read them, they tell you something about how the show stands up after all this time and what has kept it standing. Closing. The town that never ends. We've been in Springfield for a while now. We've looked at the refrigerator. We've read the church sign. We've listened to the plant hum in the background of scenes that never acknowledge it. We've tracked Hans Moleman across decades of impossible survivals. We've decoded the chalkboard gags and the couch gags and the production codes. We've looked at Homer's eyes and Marge's hair, and Ned's mustache and Burns's steepled fingers. And what we've found in all of these details is the same thing we always find when we look closely at something we love. We find people. The people who made The Simpsons were extraordinary. Funny and smart and capable of a specific kind of love for what they were making that expresses itself in all of these details. All of these choices made at the level below attention. All of these things that nobody had to do, but somebody did anyway. The refrigerator notes didn't have to change between episodes. The chalkboard gags didn't have to function as topical commentary. The clouds didn't have to be calibrated to the emotional register of the episode they open. Somebody did these things because somebody cared. Because when you care about something, you do it right even when nobody's looking. Especially when nobody's looking. That's what all these details are, finally. Evidence of care. Evidence that the people who spent 35 years in Springfield took it seriously, treated it as a place worth inhabiting fully, worth filling with real things. They were making a cartoon and they were making something true, and they knew the difference, and they knew that both were possible at the same time. The details we've spent this time with are the shadow proof of that, the evidence that exists in the margins, in the background, in the audio mix, in the production data, and the throwaway lines. The evidence that doesn't need to be noticed because it's doing its work regardless. You've noticed it now. Springfield won't look quite the same when you go back to it. The refrigerator will be a document. The background characters will be people with histories. The hum of the plant will be present in scenes where you never heard it before. The chalkboard sentence will be testimony. Every detail we covered has been there the whole time, waiting to be found. This is the kind of show The Simpsons is. It rewards you in proportion to the attention you bring. Casual viewing gives you the jokes. Close attention gives you everything else. And everything else is extraordinary. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield with us. If something in this changed how you see the show, leave it in the comments. We genuinely read them, and the observations you bring from your own viewing experience are part of the ongoing work of understanding this show. Subscribe if you want more of this. Share it with someone who loves the show as much as you do. And the next time you sit down to watch an episode, any episode, even one you've seen 40 times, look at the refrigerator. Read the sign on the church. Listen for the hum under everything. It's always been there. Expanded Deep Dives. Deep Dive, The Simpsons Kitchen and what it says about America. Let's go back to the Simpson kitchen, because we didn't finish there. We talked about the refrigerator, but the refrigerator is only one piece of a room that deserves its own extended treatment. The Simpson kitchen is one of the most carefully designed spaces in animated history, and its design encodes a specific argument about American domestic life in the late 20th and early 21st century that the show has never explicitly made in dialogue. Look at the size of the kitchen. It's a mid-sized American kitchen. Not enormous, not cramped, exactly the size that a family like The Simpsons would plausibly have in a home like theirs. The production designers made this choice deliberately, and it matters. The kitchen is not aspirationally large the way TV kitchens often are in order to create more visual space for the camera. It is accurately, somewhat crampedly, realistically sized. This realistic sizing produces a specific visual dynamic. The family members who occupy the kitchen together are physically close to each other, in ways that a larger, more aspirational TV kitchen would not require. When Homer and Marge are in the kitchen simultaneously, they are in each other's space. When the children come through, the room fills up quickly. The physical closeness forced by the kitchen's actual size creates opportunities for the specific kind of accidental intimacy, brushing past each other, reaching over each other, the small physical negotiations of shared domestic space that the show has used repeatedly to generate both comedy and genuine warmth. The color of the kitchen, the specific yellow-orange of the walls, the specific green of certain surfaces, is a deliberate visual choice with a specific historical referent. These are the colors of American kitchens from a particular era. Not any specific era, but an aggregate impression of American domestic interior design from the 1970s through the 1990s, the period during which the people making the show grew up in American kitchens. The kitchen looks like someone's memory of a kitchen rather than an actual kitchen from any specific moment. And that quality of remembered rather than documented domesticity gives it an emotional resonance that a more precisely period-appropriate design would lack. The kitchen table is worth attention. American domestic life in the 20th century organized itself significantly around the kitchen table. It was the site of family negotiation, of homework, of arguments resolved and arguments started, of the daily rituals of shared meals that provided the basic structure of family time. The Simpson kitchen table hosts all of these functions across the series, and the visual design of the table, its specific size, its relationship to the available seating, the position it occupies in the kitchen's spatial layout, accommodates exactly the family dynamics the show needs it to accommodate. There is a specific shot configuration that the show returns to constantly. The family seated at the kitchen table in their specific assigned positions, Homer at the head, Marge to his right, children arranged in a way that reflects their relative proximity to each parent, the camera positioned to include all five of them in frame. This configuration is one of the most repeated visual compositions in the series, and its repetition is the show's most basic visual argument. This is a family. This is the family. This table, these positions, this specific arrangement of five yellow people in a slightly too small kitchen is the irreducible unit that everything else in the show exists around and returns to. The kitchen also contains something that most rooms in the show don't: genuine labor. Marge is shown working in the kitchen, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the physical infrastructure of the household, with a frequency and a specificity of detail that distinguishes this space from others in the show. The kitchen is the room where work happens, visible, continuous, mostly performed by Marge, mostly unremarked upon by the other family members. The show's relationship with this labor is complex. On one level, it simply reflects the reality it depicts. A household in which one parent, Homer, works outside the home and the other, Marge, works inside it, with the domestic work being the less visible and less valorized of the two. The kitchen scenes don't comment on this explicitly. They don't editorialize about the distribution of domestic labor. They just show it accurately, which is itself a kind of commentary. The kitchen also functions, in certain episodes, as a site of Marge's private life, the space where she has moments of interior experience that the family's chaos doesn't reach. Early in the morning, before the household activates. Late at night, after everyone else is asleep. The kitchen in these moments is quieter, differently lit, and the Marge who occupies it is slightly different from the Marge who occupies it during the family's waking hours. She is more fully herself in the empty kitchen at 6 in the morning than she is anywhere else in the show. This isn't pointed out. The show doesn't frame it as a revelation, it's just there in a handful of specific scenes across the series, available to anyone who is paying attention to Marge rather than to whatever crisis is about to erupt. Deep dive. The sound of Homer's car. Homer's car is not just a car. It is a specific, identifiable, deeply characterful sonic presence that contributes to the show's audio identity in ways that most viewers process entirely unconsciously. The car sounds like Homer. This is not a metaphor. The specific sounds associated with Homer's car, the way it starts, reluctantly with effort, the way it accelerates with more noise than speed, the way it stops, abruptly, usually at the wrong moment, the sound it makes when something goes wrong, which is often, are designed to mirror Homer's own physical and psychological characteristics. The car starts reluctantly because Homer starts reluctantly. The engine turns over with a specific quality of effortful groaning that is a perfect audio analogy for Homer's relationship with mornings, with responsibilities, with any demand that requires him to shift from rest to action. The car is reluctant the way Homer is reluctant, and its reluctance is both comic and entirely plausible given what we know about the car's maintenance history. The acceleration sound is interesting because it maps onto Homer's specific kind of enthusiasm, the enthusiasm of someone who commits fully once they've committed, who has no modulation between stopped and going, who tends toward either total inertia or sudden explosive action with nothing in between. The car accelerates the same way. It's either not moving or it's moving too fast, with a transition between the states that is briefer than physics should allow. The car's malfunction sounds are the audio equivalent of Homer's physical misfortunes. Surprising, specific, more elaborate than the situation calls for. Homer doesn't just get hurt. He gets hurt in ways that are specifically, precisely wrong. The car doesn't just break down. It breaks down in ways that reveal, in their specificity, exactly how incompetently it has been maintained. The sounds of the breakdowns are correspondingly specific. Not generic engine failure sounds, but the particular audio signatures of particular things going wrong in particular ways. The car is also, from a production standpoint, one of the show's most consistent sonic signatures, a sound that appears in hundreds of episodes that viewers recognize immediately and unconsciously associate with the show. The car sound is to The Simpsons what certain music cues are to other shows, an immediately legible identifier that signals you are in this world now. When the car sounds have been changed, in specific episodes that are deliberately doing something different, that are presenting a version of Homer or Springfield that is in some way altered, the alteration is one of the tells. If Homer's car sounds different, something is different about Homer's world. The sonic signature is so established that any deviation from it registers as meaningful. Deep dive. Springfield's institutional ecosystem and how it fails. Every single resident Springfield has a complete institutional ecosystem. A school, a hospital, a police department, a court system, a city government, a fire department, a religious establishment. Every institution that a real American community has, Springfield has a version of, and every single one of those institutions, without exception, fails its residents consistently. This is one of the show's most sustained arguments, made not in any single episode or monologue, but in the aggregate of hundreds of episodes across 3.5 decades. Springfield's institutions exist. They have the form and the trappings of functional civic infrastructure, and they do not work. The school fails its students in specific, documented ways that the show returns to constantly. The educational system represented by Springfield Elementary is not just underfunded and understaffed, though it is both. It is philosophically misdirected in ways that the show analyzes with real precision. The school's relationship with Bart, for example, is a portrait of an institutional failure to respond to a student whose intelligence and energy are real but unconventionally directed. The school has one model of success, and Bart doesn't fit it. And the school's response to this mismatch is to treat Bart as a problem, rather than to consider whether the model is the problem. Lisa's experience at the same school is a different institutional failure. The school can recognize her intelligence but has no real provision for developing it. Lisa is given recognition and occasionally advanced opportunity, but the recognition is isolated rather than systemic. It depends on individual teachers rather than on any institutional commitment to students like her. When the right teacher is present, Lisa flourishes. When that teacher leaves, the institution offers her nothing. The school cannot sustain what the exceptional teacher provides because the exceptional teacher is an anomaly within the institution rather than an expression of it. The hospital fails its patients in a specific way that the show is particularly interested in. It is functional for patients who have resources and dysfunctional for patients who don't. Dr. Hibbert represents the hospital's best case, competent, caring, genuinely skilled. But Dr. Hibbert's care is not equally available to everyone in Springfield, and the show, through its portrayal of Dr. Nick Riviera, and the various ways that people in Springfield who can't afford Dr. Hibbert obtain medical care, makes a persistent argument about what healthcare distribution actually means in practice. The police department's failures are probably the show's most consistently explored institutional subject. Chief Clancy Wiggum is not stupid. This is a common misreading of the character. He is something more interesting. a man of actual competence who has been so thoroughly shaped by an institutional culture of incompetence and corruption that his competence has nowhere to go. He knows things. He sometimes shows genuine investigative instinct. And then the institution reasserts itself, and the investigation goes nowhere. And Springfield's crime and corruption continue because the institution that is supposed to address them is too embedded in Springfield's power structure to actually do so. The court system makes explicit what the other institutions imply. In Springfield, legal outcomes are not determined by evidence or by the law as written, but by the specific constellation of power, connection, and institutional inertia that surrounds each case. Burns is never seriously prosecuted for anything. Homer is convicted and acquitted on the basis of evidence that is, in various episodes, clearly insufficient for either outcome. The legal system in Springfield reaches the conclusions that Springfield's social structure requires it to reach. The city government is perhaps the most directly and explicitly corrupt of Springfield's institutions, and the show has fun with this in ways that are both obviously satirical and uncomfortably accurate. Mayor Quimby is a figure of deliberate excess. His corruption is theatrical, his incompetence is flamboyant, his relationship with the public interest is one of systematic indifference to it. But the excess is the point. The theatrical corruption of Quimby is the show's way of making visible what real municipal corruption typically works hard to conceal. That the institution exists primarily to serve the interests of the people who control it, and that public welfare is at best a secondary consideration. The fire department, the religious institutions, the various civic organizations that appear throughout the series. Each of them is a version of the same portrait. Each of them has the form of function while failing at function. Each of them exists in Springfield as a symbol of civic health that does not translate into actual civic health. The aggregate of these institutional failures produces the show's most sophisticated social argument, that Springfield is not failed by the absence of institutions, but by the presence of institutions that have been captured by the interests they are supposed to check. The school isn't failing because there's no school. The police aren't failing because there's no police. The hospital isn't failing because there's no hospital. They're failing because the institutions have been shaped by the same power dynamics that produced Burns, that produced the contaminated water supply, that produced the episodic amnesia, that produced all of it. You don't fix Springfield by adding more institutions. You fix Springfield by changing who the institutions serve. The show knows this. It has known it from the beginning. And it has never said it quite that directly, but it has said it in every institutional failure across 35 years of very close attention to the question. Deep Dive: The Specific Tragedy of Bart Simpson. Bart Simpson is the most misunderstood character in The Simpsons, and he has been for 35 years. He is understood as a rebel, as a troublemaker, as a bad student who is also somehow lovable. He is understood as the character who popularized a certain kind of irreverence in popular culture in the early 1990s. The character who made it cool to be a little kid who didn't care about authority. He is the don't have a cow man kid. He is the skateboard. He is the prank calls to Moe's Tavern. None of this is wrong, but none of it is the whole story of Bart Simpson. And the part that gets left out is the part that makes him one of the most interesting characters in the show's history. Bart Simpson is a child who is consistently failed by adults, who responds to that failure with exactly the kind of behavior the show's writers knew would make him an icon rather than a sympathetic figure, and who has, in the gaps between the jokes, a specific and painful interior life that the show has touched on carefully, in fragments, across hundreds of episodes. The failure of the adults around Bart is systematic and specific. His school has no real provision for someone with his particular intelligence. Quick, associative, practical, resistant to the structures of formal assessment. The show has repeatedly depicted Bart demonstrating real capability in contexts that fall outside the school's frameworks. He's a skilled skateboarder who understands physics through practice, a natural salesman who understands social dynamics through observation, a creative thinker who generates original approaches to problems. None of this counts in Springfield Elementary's accounting. His father's failure is the most emotionally loaded one. Homer loves Bart. This is never in question. The love is genuine, imperfect, inconsistently expressed, sometimes expressed as the strangling that has become the show's most iconic physical gag. But underneath the strangling, and the show has been explicit about this in multiple episodes that allow Homer's love for Bart to be visible without the comedy armor, Homer genuinely sees Bart as an extension of himself, as the mischievous child he never fully stopped being, as the son in whom he recognizes something essential. But Homer is also, consistently, unable to be the father Bart needs in specific moments. He is not present in the ways that matter. He is not available for the conversations that Bart needs to have. He is not perceptive enough, consistently enough, to notice what Bart is going through beneath the performance of not caring. Bart performs not caring because he has learned, through experience, through watching what happens to vulnerability in the Simpson household and in Springfield more broadly, that caring visibly is dangerous. Caring visibly invites disappointment. Caring visibly requires you to acknowledge that you wanted something and didn't get it. The performance of not caring is Bart's defense mechanism, and it is extraordinarily effective. It has made him an icon. But the show, in its best Bart episodes, strips the defense away. There are episodes in which Bart cries, really cries, the kind of crying that is not played for comedy. There are episodes in which he expresses longing for his father's attention, for academic success, for connection with other people who see him clearly. There are episodes in which he demonstrates a genuine moral seriousness, a capacity for ethical reasoning that sits entirely outside his public persona. These episodes are not the ones that get quoted at parties. They're not the source of the show's Bart-related cultural touchstones. But they are the episodes that tell you who Bart Simpson actually is, underneath the skateboard and the catchphrases. He is a child who wants, more than anything, to be taken seriously, by his teachers, by his father, by the world that has decided, largely on the basis of his behavior in situations where he had no reason to behave well, that he is someone to be managed rather than someone to be understood. The specific tragedy of Bart Simpson is that his intelligence, real, genuine, specific to his nature, has never been met by an institution or a relationship adequate to develop it. He has the mind to become something interesting, and Springfield has never offered him the conditions for it. The show knows this. It has shown you this in fragments across decades. It just also knows that Bart as an icon is more culturally powerful than Bart as a tragedy, and it has chosen to serve both without fully committing to either, which means that the real Bart, the child underneath the performance, lives in the margins of a show that has made a caricature of him famous. He's there when you look for him. He's always been there. Deep Dive: what the Quickie Mart actually is. The Quickie Mart is Springfield's convenience store and one of the show's most consistent locations. Apu Nahasapi Mapatilan, the store's proprietor, is one of the show's most complex and most debated characters. But the store itself, the Quickie Mart as a physical space, as an institution, as a site of specific kinds of social interaction, deserves attention independent of the controversies surrounding its proprietor. The Quickie Mart is the show's portrait of a specific American institution, the convenience store as community anchor for people who don't have access to better options. This is a real phenomenon. In communities across America, convenience stores, particularly those run by immigrant entrepreneurs who live above or near the store and are open at hours when other businesses are closed, function as informal community centers, as the places where people go not just for cigarettes and hot dogs, but for contact, for information, for a moment of human interaction in an otherwise isolated daily life. The Quickie Mart performs this function for a specific subset of Springfield's residents, the people who are at the margins of the town's social structure, who don't have access to the more official community spaces, who find themselves needing something at 10 in the evening, and who find in the Quickie Mart not just the something, but also a moment of reliable human presence. Apu's relationship with his regular customers is, when you map it carefully across episodes, one of the show's most consistent portraits of a specific kind of service relationship that is also a human relationship. He knows his customers. He knows their habits, their preferences, their lives, in the way that someone who sees people regularly in small transactional moments accumulates a kind of intimate knowledge of them. He knows Homer's relationship with food and with money. He knows about Marge's family anxieties. He knows things about Springfield's residents that those residents themselves might not know that anyone knows. The Quickie Mart also functions as a site of economic tension that the show depicts with more precision than is usually acknowledged. Apu's prices are high, higher than a real grocery store, higher than makes economic sense for many of his customers. He is in the traditional analysis of convenience store economics, extracting a premium from customers who have no better option. This is the reality of convenience store economics in underserved communities, and the show depicts it without entirely excusing it. But the show also depicts the other side of this. The cost to Apu of maintaining the store, the hours he keeps, the personal sacrifice involved in being open at 3 in the morning when no one else is, the relationship between the store's economic function and the community function that the economics enable. The Quickie Mart is expensive. It is also the place that is there. And the show holds both of these truths simultaneously without resolving the tension between them into an easier single statement. The store's physical design is consistent with this dual character. It is simultaneously shabby and somehow reliable. The kind of place that looks like it is always on the verge of closing and has somehow never closed. That is maintained with the minimum investment necessary to remain functional. The shelving is adequate. The lighting is institutional. The product selection is idiosyncratic in a way that reflects purchasing decisions made on the basis of availability and cost rather than market research. It looks like a store run by someone who is doing this alone, who doesn't have staff and doesn't have the capital to invest in the kind of physical upgrading that would make the store less marginal. It looks like what it is. A one-person operation making the economics work through personal effort rather than through the advantages that scale provides. The Quickie Mart is the physical embodiment of a specific kind of immigrant entrepreneurship, the kind that fills gaps in communities that corporate retail has decided are not worth serving, that provides services that would otherwise not exist, at a cost that reflects the absence of alternatives. The show knows all of this. It has known it from the store's first appearance. It just says it in architecture rather than dialogue. Deep dive. Marge's painting and what art means in Springfield. There is an episode in which Marge Simpson discovers that she is a talented painter. She paints a portrait of Mr. Burns that captures something true about him, something that his public persona obscures and that her eye, unconditioned by power and wealth, to see him as he wishes to be seen, perceives directly. The painting is good. It is recognized as good. It creates a brief, strange moment in which Marge's private vision intersects with the public world in a way that produces actual consequence. And then it ends. The episode ends. And Marge does not become a painter. Her talent does not reshape her life. The painting exists in the show's past, acknowledged, and then set aside, the way Marge's various capacities are consistently acknowledged and then set aside by the show's structure and by the structure of her life. This is one of the show's recurring patterns, and it is a pattern that deserves to be named and examined. Marge has talents and ambitions then that the show reveals in specific episodes and then does not develop across the series. She is a painter. She is a writer. She has entrepreneurial capacity. She has political instincts. She has more of everything that constitutes the raw material of a significant life than the life the show depicts her living. And the show never quite resolves this tension. It doesn't resolve it by having Marge sacrifice her ambitions to her family and being shown the cost of that sacrifice. It doesn't resolve it by having her develop her talents and finding that development transforming her life. It holds the tension open, episode after episode, depicting a woman whose capabilities exceed her circumstances without committing to what that discrepancy means or what should be done about it. The painting is the clearest example because painting is a form of vision, and Marge's vision, her capacity to see accurately, to perceive what other people miss or choose not to see, is the most consistent of her gifts. She sees Homer for what he is and loves him anyway. She sees her children's struggles before her children can articulate them. She sees Springfield's dysfunction with a clarity that she applies productively by managing it rather than fighting it. When that seeing becomes externalized as painting, it becomes visible to others in a way her ordinary seeing isn't. The painting of Burns works because Marge saw Burns accurately, saw through the performance of power to the ancient, frightened, profoundly isolated man underneath. Her seeing produced something that the subject himself recognized as true, which is why the episode creates its specific dramatic tension. The subject is unsettled by the accuracy of the portrayal, by the fact that someone looked at him clearly enough to produce this. The painting exists in the show's internal world as evidence that Marge's seeing is real and significant, and then it is put away. The next episode doesn't reference it. The Marge who painted Burns is the same Marge who will not paint again in the show's mainstream narrative, who will remain the center of the household rather than the subject of her own story. This is the specific tragedy that the show keeps touching and retreating from. Marge is the most fully realized character in the Simpson family in certain respects, the most emotionally intelligent, the most perceptive, the most capable of sustained attention to what actually matters. And the show, by structural necessity and by the specific cultural moment of its production, keeps returning her to the household after each glimpse of what she might be outside it. She stays. She always stays. And the show knows what that means, and it shows you what that means, and it does not always know what to do with what it has shown you. Deep Dive: the real relationship between Homer and Burns. We have established, in various parts of this script, the documented history of the relationship between Homer Simpson and Charles Montgomery Burns. Burns drove Mona Simpson underground, ensuring Homer grew up motherless. Abe made a deal that guaranteed Homer's employment in exchange for silence about Burns's crimes. Homer works for Burns without understanding the architecture of that arrangement. But there is a layer to this relationship that goes beyond the conspiracy, and it is a layer the show has explored in specific episodes that are not typically discussed in the context of this theme. The genuine, strange, entirely unequal affection that exists between these two characters. Burns cannot remember Homer's name. This is one of the show's most durable jokes. He knows Homer is an employee. He knows Homer occupies a specific sector of his plant. He has interacted with Homer in enough context to know that Homer exists as a distinct individual. And yet he consistently fails to retain the name Homer Simpson in a way that functions in the show's logic as a running gag about Burns's contempt for those below him on the social hierarchy. But there are specific episodes, and they are among the most interesting episodes in the series, in which Burns and Homer are placed in genuine proximity, in which the social distance between them collapses by force of circumstance. And what emerges in those episodes is not simply comic. Burns, in proximity to Homer, sometimes experiences something that the show codes as recognition. Not of Homer's name, not of Homer's qualities in any conventional sense, but something more basic, the recognition of a presence that is entirely unlike anyone Burns has known for the 100+ years of his life. Burns has existed primarily among people who want something from him. His life has been organized by power dynamics in which every human relationship is shaped by the fact of his wealth. Smithers loves him, but Smithers' love is inseparable from servitude. The politicians and executives who interact with Burns do so because of his power. Everyone who approaches Burns approaches him through the intermediary of what he has. Homer doesn't care. This is not a virtue Homer has cultivated. It is simply an aspect of his cognitive profile. He is incapable of the sustained social strategy that approaching a powerful person with an ulterior motive requires. When Homer is in Burns's presence, he is simply Homer. He responds to Burns the way he responds to any person, with his unmediated, chaotic, specific self. For Burns, this is genuinely strange. He has lived a century without experiencing an interaction that is not shaped by power. Homer's inability to strategize his way through a social encounter is, from Burns's perspective, a kind of radical authenticity he has no experience with. The episodes that explore this, that put Homer and Burns in genuine proximity without the usual comic buffer of the power dynamic, tend to be the series' most quietly moving examinations of what it costs to live entirely by power. Burns in these episodes is not simply a villain. He is a portrait of something sadder, a man so thoroughly defined by his role that the human being inside the role has almost no room to exist. Homer gives that human being room, briefly, in specific moments. Not because Homer intends to, but because Homer is incapable of the deference that would maintain the role's dominance. Homer is too obtuse to be properly dominated by Burns, and in that obtuseness, In that failure of proper social hierarchy, something exists between them that the show has never fully named. It is not friendship. It is not love. It is something stranger. The specific recognition between two people who are, in their different ways, equally unable to perform the social roles that their circumstances assign them. Burns cannot perform functional humanity. Homer cannot perform functional social awareness. In the overlap of those two incapacities, something almost human occasionally emerges. The show knows this is there. It touches it carefully in specific moments, and then returns to the comedy of their relationship because the comedy is what the show needs structurally. But the something almost human between Homer and Burns is real, and it is one of the show's best-kept emotional secrets. Deep Dive: The Treehouse of Horror. As Springfield's unconscious. Every October, The Simpsons abandons its continuity, its consequence, its commitments to realistic character behavior, and produces The Treehouse of Horror, an anthology of horror and science fiction parodies presented as a special event outside the show's normal reality. The conventional reading of the Treehouse of Horror episodes is that they are pure comedy, parody vehicles that allow the show to explore genre fiction without the constraints of the main series, to kill characters who can't be killed in the main timeline, to explore scenarios that would be impossible in the show's normal mode. This reading is not wrong, but it misses something important. The specific content of what the Treehouse of Horror episodes choose to explore across their run constitutes a pattern that is not random. The fears and preoccupations of the Treehouse of Horror are the fears and preoccupations of Springfield's unconscious, the things the main series cannot examine directly because they would rupture the comedy, examined here under the protective cover of "This is the horror special, none of it counts." What does Springfield fear? The catalog of Treehouse of Horror scenarios assembled across decades provides the answer with extraordinary comprehensiveness. Springfield fears losing control of the technologies it has created. This is the most consistent thematic thread across all of the horror specials. Technology. Robots, machines, devices, systems that turns on its creators, that becomes autonomous, that cannot be managed or controlled. The nuclear plant is the most obvious external representation of this fear in the main series. The Treehouse of Horror externalizes it in more literal ways. Robots who develop consciousness and turn on humans, machines that consume their operators, scientific experiments that produce consequences their creators cannot contain. Springfield fears death, specifically the death that is denied. The horror specials return repeatedly to scenarios involving the undead, the returning dead, the dead who do not stay dead. This is interesting in the context of a show in which death is largely non-permanent in the main series anyway. The fear being explored in these scenarios is not really the fear of death. It is the fear of what death's denial costs. The undead in the Treehouse of Horror are not comfortable presences. They are distortions. Their return from death is a problem, not a comfort, and the scenarios consistently explore the specific horror of a world in which the finality of death has been compromised. Springfield fears the truth being revealed. Many of the horror specials involve scenarios in which something hidden comes to light, a secret creature, a hidden identity, a suppressed history. These scenarios mirror the main series' persistent dynamic of Springfield's collective denial being maintained against the pressure of truths that want to be acknowledged. In the horror specials, the denial fails. The truths emerge. The consequences are terrible. The show uses the horror anthology format to explore what would happen if all of the suppression mechanisms that maintain Springfield's comfortable unreality broke down. The horror specials are Springfield's nightmare of being found out, of the radiation becoming undeniable, the denial machinery breaking, the truth about the principle becoming permanent, the history of Burns's crimes becoming public and permanent knowledge. The fact that these scenarios are framed as horror, as events to be feared and survived, tells you something about how deeply Springfield has internalized its own suppression mechanisms. The truth is presented as a monster, not because the truth is actually monstrous, but because a community built on denial experiences the truth as monstrous. The Treehouse of Horror is the show's most honest portrait of what the maintenance of Springfield's normal reality actually requires: the treatment of truth as threat. This is the Treehouse of Horror's secret function. Under the Halloween costumes, And the genre parodies and the magnificent comedy, it is the show processing in the only form it can, the consequence-free horror anthology. The specific anxieties that the main series is too invested in its own normalcy to directly address. It is Springfield dreaming, and like all dreams, it tells you more than the dreamer intends. Deep dive, the question of Lisa's future, and what the show is afraid to answer. Lisa Simpson is going to leave Springfield. This is the most certain thing in the show's future, more certain than any specific plot development, more certain than any character event. Lisa Simpson, if the show were to age its characters forward and follow them to their plausible futures, would leave Springfield. She would go to college. She would go somewhere that her intelligence and her values could find a context. She would build a life that Springfield, in its current state, cannot offer her. The show has shown this. The flash-forward episode Lisa's Wedding depicts a 23-year-old Lisa who has done exactly this, who is educated, professionally engaged, living a life in a world larger than Springfield. And the episode's emotional core is her return to Springfield for her engagement, and the complex mixture of love and claustrophobia that the return produces. The episode does something the show rarely does. It asks what Springfield would look like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who got out and came back. And the answer is that Springfield looks smaller. It looks sadder. It looks in a way that is both comic and genuinely moving. Exactly like what it is. A town that some people are capable of outgrowing, and that the capacity to outgrow is both a kind of gift and a specific kind of loss. Lisa, in the flash forward, loves her family. This is never in question. The love is the stable thing, the thing that doesn't change with education or with the expansion of context. But the love exists in tension, in the flash forward, with a recognition of who she has become, of the distance between the world she inhabits as an adult and the world she grew up in. The show does not develop this forward. It shows it once and returns Lisa to 8 years old, where she will remain for as long as the show runs. And the question of what that return costs, of what it means to show a character a glimpse of her own potential development and then deny it, is one the show has chosen not to answer directly. But the flash forward exists. It is in the show's internal record, and it establishes permanently and canonically that the version of Lisa who could exist in a future where the floating timeline is allowed to move is a version who is happy, who is more herself, who has found contexts in which her specific qualities are valued rather than endured. Springfield holds her here not because it is good for her. It holds her here because losing her would hurt everyone else, because Lisa is the moral center, the person whose continued presence affirms that Springfield still has the capacity to produce and sustain that kind of integrity. Her staying is for the community's benefit, not hers. This is the show's most uncomfortable admission, tucked inside a flash-forward episode that is usually discussed in terms of its emotional sweetness rather than its structural implications. The show loves Lisa enough to imagine her free. It loves Springfield enough, or it fears losing Springfield's moral center enough, to keep her frozen. The 8-year-old with the saxophone is not who Lisa is. She is who Lisa is right now, in this episode, in this moment, contained here for reasons that have nothing to do with her nature and everything to do with the needs of the story that surrounds her. And somewhere in the show's future, in the futures it has glimpsed and retreated from, in the futures its writers have imagined and declined to commit to, there is a grown Lisa who plays better saxophone than anyone in Springfield has ever heard, and who loves her family with the full complexity of a person who chose to love them rather than simply having been born to. That Lisa is real. The show has shown her to us, and every episode that returns 8-year-old Lisa to her room with her saxophone is a choice about what to sacrifice in order to keep the loop running. The show knows this too. It has always known this. Deep Dive, the specific comedy of Burns and Smithers and what it actually depicts. The relationship between Mr. Burns and Waylon Smithers is one of the most analyzed relationships in the show, and it has been discussed primarily through the lens of the specific dimension of Smithers' character that the show was, for most of its run, not permitted to state directly. That dimension is now well documented and openly discussed, and the show eventually addressed it explicitly in later seasons. But there is another dimension of the Burns-Smithers relationship that gets less attention: what it says about the specific nature of loyalty in conditions of extreme power imbalance. Smithers is loyal to Burns with an absoluteness that exceeds anything the show depicts in other relationships. Homer's loyalty to Marge is genuine but conditional. It fails under specific pressures, it has its lapses. It is the loyalty of a person who genuinely loves another person and is also genuinely fallible. Smithers' loyalty to Burns has no such lapses. It is total, it is continuous. It functions even when Burns is wrong, even when Burns is cruel, even when Burns does things that Smithers privately finds repugnant. The show has explored the limits of this loyalty in specific episodes, episodes that place Smithers in situations where his loyalty to Burns directly conflicts with his ethical values, his self-interest, or his desire for connection with other people. In these episodes, Smithers consistently chooses Burns. Not always without cost, not always without expressing the conflict, but always consistently. This absolute loyalty is not, the show suggests, simply the product of Smithers' personal devotion. It has a structural dimension. Smithers has organized his entire life around Burns. His professional identity, his daily routine, his social world, such as it is, his sense of purpose, all of it is defined by his relationship with Burns. To withdraw from that relationship would not just be to leave a job or to lose an attachment. It would be to lose the entire structure by which Smithers makes sense of himself. This is one of the show's most unsparing portraits of a certain kind of institutional capture, the way that a person can become so thoroughly defined by their role within a powerful institution that the possibility of existing outside that role becomes genuinely unthinkable. Not because they lack the capacity to imagine it, but because the institution has shaped their self-concept so thoroughly that outside the institution, they cannot quite locate themselves. Burns has this effect on Smithers not through any deliberate act of psychological manipulation, though Burns is certainly capable of deliberate manipulation, but through the simple exercise of his power over a long enough period that the power relationship has become the relationship, and the relationship has become Smithers' most fundamental fact about himself. The comedy of the Burns-Smithers dynamic, and it is genuinely funny, deeply and consistently funny across hundreds of episodes, is built on this foundation of something much more melancholy. The joke about Smithers is always a joke about what happens to a person who loves something that cannot love them back in kind, who has organized their entire existence around an attachment that is asymmetric in a way that the attached person either cannot see or chooses not to see. Burns values Smithers. This is important to establish. He would be worse off without Smithers, and on some level he knows this, even if his expression of that knowledge is typically buried under layers of institutional behavior. The value is real, but the value is functional. The value of an excellent and irreplaceable instrument, not the value of a person whose existence matters in itself. Smithers knows this somewhere. The show shows you the knowing in specific scenes, moments where something crosses Smithers' face that is not loyalty and not devotion, but something more complex, a recognition of the nature of the arrangement he has accepted and a choice, renewed in that moment, to accept it anyway. That choice is what makes Smithers one of the show's most human characters, even in the specific sadness of it. He is a person making a choice. The choice is not a good one, not in any simple accounting of what's good for him, but it is coherent, it has an internal logic. And the show respects that logic enough to depict it honestly rather than simply using Smithers as a joke about unrequited devotion. Deep dive. The show's relationship with its own legacy. The Simpsons has been running long enough that it now exists in a complicated relationship with its own history. Earlier seasons have become canonical cultural objects, episodes that have been analyzed, quoted, referenced, and celebrated enough to have an existence independent of the show that produced them. The early seasons of The Simpsons are, for a generation of viewers, foundational cultural experiences. They are the thing against which all subsequent comedy has been measured. This creates a specific problem for the show in its later seasons. How do you make a show that exists in the shadow of its own peak? How do you produce new episodes when the most common critical response to new episodes is comparison with old ones, when the show's greatest competition is its own past? The show has handled this in different ways at different points. There have been periods when it tried to ignore the comparison, producing new work without self-consciousness about the legacy. There have been periods when it addressed the comparison directly, through meta-episodes that acknowledged the show's long history and its complicated relationship with its own reputation. There have been periods when it seemed to lean into a different mode, accepting that it would not produce work that competed with the peak seasons, and instead focusing on other virtues. None of these approaches has been entirely satisfying. The comparison with the peak seasons is not avoidable, partly because the peak seasons are genuinely extraordinary, and partly because the cultural status of those seasons is now so thoroughly established that any new Simpsons episode exists in their context automatically. But there is something interesting that has happened in the show's later period that doesn't get enough acknowledgement. The show has developed, in its long tail, a specific kind of value that the peak seasons don't have and couldn't have. The late period Simpsons has the value of duration. It has the value of a show that has been present, continuously, for more time than most of its current viewers have been alive. The characters are not just characters anymore. They are something closer to cultural furniture, to shared reference points so thoroughly embedded in the collective imagination that their continued existence serves a function different from entertainment. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are not primarily television characters for most of the people who encountered them in the early seasons. They are something more like imaginary companions from a specific period of life, presences associated with the specific texture of the time when you first knew them. Their continued appearance in new episodes is not quite experienced as new storytelling. It is experienced as a kind of ongoing proof that something from that time still exists. This is a strange kind of value, and it is not what the show was designed to provide. But it is real, and it explains something about the show's continued viewership that pure quality assessment would not. People watch The Simpsons in its later seasons not primarily because the episodes are as good as they used to be. They watch because the characters are still there, and the existence of the characters is itself a form of continuity with something people don't want to lose. The show understands this, at least implicitly. The later season's most successful episodes tend to be the ones that activate the emotional dimension of long-term familiarity, that use the audience's relationship with these characters to produce feelings that newer or fresher work couldn't produce because the feelings depend on the accumulated weight of decades. This is the specific gift of duration. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be manufactured. It exists only at the end of a very long commitment to a very specific set of characters in a very specific world. The Simpsons has that. And in the specific register of that, it is still doing something that nothing else can do. Deep dive. What the Simpsons house actually represents, 742 Evergreen Terrace, is one of the most famous addresses in American popular culture. More people know this address than know the addresses of most actual historical sites. The house at that address has been depicted, in various forms and angles and interior configurations, more times than perhaps any other fictional building in the history of television. What is it? The obvious answer is that it's the Simpson family home, the physical anchor of the show's domestic narrative, the container that holds the family together. This is correct. But the house is also, in a larger sense, the show's most concentrated symbol of its central argument about American life. The house is the American dream made concrete and slightly run down. It is the mid-century promise of homeownership as the basic unit of middle-class stability, showing the specific signs of strain that promise has accumulated over the decades since it was made. The house is maintained, but not upgraded. It has what it needs to function, but not what it would need to be impressive. The lawn is mowed, but not landscaped. The kitchen is equipped, but not renovated. The cars in the driveway work, but are not new. The house is, in every specific detail of its presentation, the home of a family that is managing, that is sustaining the basic form of the middle-class domestic ideal without the resources to develop it beyond the basic form. This is the specific condition that The Simpsons was built to depict. The American working middle-class family in the late 20th century, holding on to the structures of middle-class life with increasing effort, sustained by a specific combination of love and habit and the absence of better options. The house is the physical representation of that holding on, and yet the house is also genuinely beautiful in its specific way. The yellow light in the kitchen in the early evening. The specific quality of the living room when everyone is gathered in it. The feel of a space that is deeply inhabited, that carries the accumulated marks of a family's actual life. The scuff marks and the clutter and the refrigerator drawings and the specific disorder of a home where real people live rather than a home that exists to be admired. The house is beautiful in the way that ordinary things are beautiful when you love them, when they carry the weight of your actual life rather than an aspirational projection of what your life should be. Homer loves this house. The show has made this explicit in various moments in a way that is neither ironic nor qualified. He loves it with the specific love of someone who has something real, who knows it is real, who would be devastated to lose it. This love is one of the things about Homer that makes him legible as a human being, rather than simply as a comic character. The love of a house, of a specific, imperfect, thoroughly ordinary house that is his, is not a sophisticated thing to love. It is a very simple thing, and it is entirely true. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is not aspirational. It is actual. It is what people have rather than what they want to have, made present and real and beloved, in a way that aspirational representations of domestic life cannot achieve. It is, in the end, the most honest image of American domestic life in the history of American television. Not because it is perfect, because it is exactly what it is. Deep dive. The writers who loved Springfield and what they left behind. The Simpsons has had hundreds of writers across its history. Many have stayed for multiple seasons. Some have stayed for decades. Others have come through for a season or two and moved on to other things. The collective authorship of the show is one of the most complex in television history, involving more individual voices, more distinct sensibilities, more varied perspectives than almost any comparable project. What is remarkable, given this collective authorship, is how consistent the show's deepest commitments have been across the decades and across the changes in the writing staff. The specific things The Simpsons cares about, the institutional critique, the portrait of family love as something real and imperfect, the use of humor to approach things that are genuinely difficult, the insistence on Springfield's residents as real people rather than jokes, persist across generations of writers in ways that suggest not just a strong editorial hand, but a genuine culture. The best writers who worked on The Simpsons left specific marks in the show's internal record that fans have learned to recognize. Episodes written by John Swartzwelder, the show's most prolific and most idiosyncratic contributor, have a specific quality of formally strange comedy that is immediately recognizable to people who know his work. Episodes written by the teams responsible for the show's peak seasons have a specific emotional intelligence, a specific willingness to let the show be genuinely moving, that distinguishes them from episodes produced in other periods. What these writers left behind, in the specific episodes they produced, is a record of what was possible when the conditions were right, when the talent, the resources, the creative latitude, and the shared commitment of a writer's room aligned to produce something that exceeded the sum of its parts. Some of those episodes are among the finest half hours in the history of television. Not just the finest animated content, not just the finest comedy. The finest television, measured against anything the medium has produced in its history. This claim is not exaggeration. It is the considered judgment of critics and scholars who have spent serious time with the work. The people who made those episodes were working on a cartoon. They were producing content for a broadcast network, under commercial pressures on production schedules that would have broken less committed people. And they made something that will last as long as the medium lasts, that will be discovered by new viewers indefinitely, that will continue to reward the attention of anyone who brings real attention to it. This is what the details we've been examining are the evidence of. The care that people brought to something they loved, expressed in choices too small to be noticed by anyone who wasn't looking. The writers loved Springfield. You can feel it in the refrigerator notes and the church sign and the background character biographies and the ambient sound design and all the rest of it. They loved this impossible, yellow, radioactive, temporally frozen, geographically impossible town. And they filled it with the specific warmth that love produces when it's expressed in attention to small things. That love is what you're feeling when you notice these details. Not your love for the show, though that's real too. You're feeling their love for it. transmitted through 35 years and hundreds of episodes, and thousands of individual choices made with care. That's what all of this is, finally. Love made visible in the details. The refrigerator is different this week because someone cared enough to make it different. The church sign has a new message because someone thought it should. The plant hums in the background of the family dinner because someone understood that it should never quite go away. All of it, every detail we've spent this time with, is evidence of people caring about something they were making. And that care is, in the end, the most remarkable thing about The Simpsons. More remarkable than the longevity, more remarkable than the influence, more remarkable than the predictions or the theories or the mythology. Someone cared enough to change the refrigerator notes. That's everything. Deep Dive. The show's politics and how it has aged. The Simpsons is a political show. This is not a claim that requires much defense. The show has engaged with American political life since its first episode, has depicted political figures and political processes and political institutions with varying degrees of satire and sympathy, and has produced some of the most pointed political commentary in the history of American television. But the politics of The Simpsons are complicated in ways that simple "the show is liberal" or "the show is conservative" framings miss. The show's political sensibility is more accurately described as populist skepticism, a deep, consistent, structurally embedded distrust of concentrated power in any form, combined with a genuine affection for and solidarity with people who are not powerful. This combination produces a show that attacks corporate power and government's incompetence with equal enthusiasm. It attacks institutional religion and institutional media. It attacks both political parties when they perform the behaviors that the show finds most corrosive: cynicism about public service, contempt for ordinary people, the prioritization of institutional survival over actual function. It is not partisan. It is anti-institutional in a way that distributes its skepticism broadly. The political content has aged differently at different points in the show's run. Episodes from the peak seasons that targeted specific political figures or specific political situations of the 1990s and early 2000s are in some cases more historically interesting than politically resonant. They document a moment more than they speak to the present. But the structural political critique, the portrait of Springfield's institutions as captured by the interests they are supposed to check, the portrait of Burns's power as essentially unaccountable, the portrait of a population too damaged by its environment to effectively challenge the conditions producing the damage, has not aged at all. If anything, the structural critique has become more relevant as the decades have passed and the specific dynamics it was capturing have become more pronounced and more visible in American life. The show predicted, in the precise sense of making visible something that was already present, but not yet fully developed, the dynamic that would come to define a certain kind of American political experience in the 21st century. The sense that the institutions of democratic governance are present but not functional, that accountability is available in form but not in practice, that the people in positions of accountability are protected from its consequences by the same dynamics that produce the problems accountability is supposed to address. This is Burns's Springfield. This has always been Burns's Springfield. And the fact that it now looks more like America than it did when the show began is not a failure of imagination by the show's creators. It is the worst kind of vindication. The show did not want to be right about this. Nobody who cares about what Springfield is a portrait of wanted the portrait to become more accurate over time. The accuracy is a function of what America became, not of any brilliance in the prediction. Burns wins. In Springfield, Burns always wins. The show told you this from the beginning and never stopped telling you and never had any reason to stop, because the thing it was documenting kept being true. Deep Dive. What the secondary cast contributes to the show's emotional range. The primary Simpson family, Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, cannot carry the show's full emotional range alone. They can carry a great deal. Family love in its various forms, the specific dynamics of parent-child relationships, the interior life of each individual character. But there are emotional territories that require characters outside the family to access, and the show's secondary cast has been constructed with the specific purpose of accessing those territories. The secondary cast covers the full range of human relationship types. Friendship. Lenny and Carl represent a specific kind of male friendship, close, undemonstrative, sustained over decades, without the explicit processing that more self-conscious relationships undergo. Romantic failure and success, Mo and Apu and various recurring characters provide the show's meditations on adult romantic life outside the context of the established Simpson marriage. Professional community, the plant workers, the school staff, the various institutional contexts in which Springfield's residents know each other through work. But the secondary cast also does something more specific. It provides the emotional perspectives that the primary family cannot provide from inside itself. Lisa's perspective, the perspective of the intelligent outsider, the person whose values are in tension with the community around her, is the show's most obviously available outside perspective. But Lisa cannot provide the perspective of, for example, age and loss, because she is permanently 8 years old. The show accesses the specific emotional content of age and loss through its older characters. Abe Simpson most extensively, but also Hans Moleman and various elderly Springfield residents who appear in specific episodes. The emotional content of loneliness, the loneliness of the single, the loneliness of the divorced, the loneliness of people who exist at the social margins, is accessed primarily through Mo and through various secondary characters whose isolation is part of their character signature. The emotional content of class aspiration and class anxiety, the specific experience of someone whose economic situation is not secure, who is always managing the gap between what they have and what they feel they should have, is explored partly through Homer, but partly through secondary characters who occupy the specific lower middle-class register that the Simpson family sometimes rises above. The secondary cast is a distributed emotional instrument constructed over decades to ensure that Springfield contains access to every significant human emotional experience. Not always in the same depth, not always in the same detail, but with enough presence and enough construction that the show can, when a specific emotional territory needs to be explored, find a character who can carry that exploration. This is one of the most invisible achievements of 35 years of careful character construction. The complete emotional ecosystem of Springfield, built in pieces by hundreds of writers who each contributed their specific character moments, each extending a character's capacity to carry a specific kind of feeling. Deep dive. The final mystery. Why we're still talking about this? Here is the real mystery of The Simpsons, the one that none of the theories we've explored today fully answers. Why, after 35 years, with hundreds of episodes, with decades of analysis and scholarship and fan obsession, is there still more to discover? Why has the complete picture never been fully assembled? Why does paying attention to this show continue to reveal things that haven't been noticed before? Part of the answer is simply volume. The show has produced more content than any comparable project in television history, and volume alone creates the conditions for inexhaustibility. There is always another episode, always another background detail, always another production code, always another throwaway line that hasn't been fully examined. But volume isn't the complete answer, because a show can have enormous volume and still be exhaustible, can have seen everything it has to show after a certain point of attention. The Simpsons has not become exhaustible in this way. People who have watched every episode multiple times continue to find things. The more honest answer is that the show was made with a specific kind of layered attention that creates genuine depth, not just volume, but genuine multiple registers of meaning that require different kinds of engagement to access. The first viewing gives you the jokes. The second viewing gives you the visual gags you missed. The close analysis gives you the background details. The production data gives you the structural patterns. The aggregation of observations over decades gives you the mythology. Each register is genuinely there. None of it is invented by overinterpretation. The refrigerator notes were changed, the clouds were calibrated, the production codes form patterns, the throwaway lines build mythology. The people who made this show were working on all of these registers simultaneously, and the result is a depth of meaning that is not artificially imposed by analysis but genuinely present in the work. And then there is the final answer, which is the most truthful one. The Simpsons is about something. It is about something that matters, about family, about the way power is organized and how it damages the people subject to it, about the specific experience of being an ordinary person in an unordinary world, about love in its imperfect, genuine, sustaining forms. It is about these things with enough seriousness and enough craft that attention to the details of how it explores these things keeps revealing something. You can exhaust a show that is about nothing or about something trivial. You cannot exhaust a show that is about something true because truth is inexhaustible. It reveals more of itself the more carefully you look at it. The Simpsons is inexhaustible because Springfield is true. Not accurate. Springfield is not accurate in any literal sense, but true in the deeper sense. It is a faithful portrait of something real about human life, rendered with enough care and enough love that it keeps having things to say. That's the final answer to the final mystery. It still has things to say. After 35 years, after nearly 800 episodes, after more analysis than almost any other piece of popular culture has received, it still has things to say. And as long as it does, there will be people paying attention, watching the refrigerator, reading the church sign, listening for the hum of the plant under everything, trying to understand what Springfield is telling us about ourselves. Because Springfield is telling us something. It always has been. It always will be. Deep Dive, the show's relationship with failure and what that teaches us. Homer Simpson fails. This is perhaps the most foundational thing about him, the thing that defines his narrative function in the show more than anything else. He fails regularly, comprehensively, and in ways that span the full range from minor domestic incompetence to catastrophic professional negligence. But here's what the show does with Homer's failure that distinguishes it from a simple portrait of a hapless man. It refuses to make failure the end of the story. Every failure, without exception, is followed by a reset. Homer falls, and then Homer gets back up, and the next episode finds him in roughly the same condition as before the fall. This narrative structure has been criticized, the reset button, the episodic reset that erases consequences, as lazy writing. And in some contexts, it is lazy writing. But in the context of what the show is trying to say about the specific experience it depicts, the reset is also something else, an argument about resilience. The kind of people Homer represents, working class and lower middle class American men of a certain generation, had lives that were structured by a similar kind of reset. You failed, and you went back to work on Monday, and the failure was absorbed into the ongoing project of survival. Not overcome, not resolved, not healed, absorbed. Made part of the continuing story without being allowed to become the whole story. The failure happened, and the next thing happened, and the next thing after that. This is not dignity in the way that triumph is dignified. It is dignity of a different and more common kind. The dignity of people who keep going, not because they have overcome something, but because stopping is not an option. Because the family is still there, and the rent is still due, and the beer is still cold, and there is still, somehow, reason to be on the couch on Sunday evening watching whatever is on. Homer's failure and reset is the show's most honest portrait of how most lives actually work. Not as narratives of triumph and redemption, but as ongoing processes of attempting and failing and attempting again. Sustained not by success, but by the sustaining structures of family and habit, and the specific pleasure of small, ordinary things done in the company of people you love. This is a harder thing to dramatize than triumph. Triumph has a shape, a beginning, a struggle, a victory. The ongoing process of attempting and failing and attempting again has no shape. It just continues. It is the shape of most lives, but not the shape of most stories, because most stories require resolution. The Simpsons found a way to make this shapelessness into form. The reset is the form. Every episode ends with a kind of equilibrium, and the equilibrium is the ongoing fact of the family. Intact, still there, still the anchor, not better, not worse. This is what the show is ultimately arguing, that the family intact, still there, still at the dinner table and on the couch and at the breakfast table is sufficient, is more than sufficient, is in its ordinary, imperfect daily form, the basic unit of human meaning. Homer fails and the family is still there. The family is still there, that's the show's thesis. Delivered in the structure of every episode, every reset, every return to the couch. The family is still there. After everything, still there. Deep Dive. What makes a great Simpsons episode great? Across 35 years of episodes, across the variations of quality that any long-running show produces, certain episodes stand out. They are discussed more, quoted more, analyzed more. They represent the show at its peak creative capacity. What makes them great? The question has been asked many times by scholars and critics and fans. Various answers have been proposed. The density of the jokes, the emotional sincerity, the precision of the satirical targets, the specific quality of the voice performances, the elegance of the plot construction. All of these answers are correct. But there is a more fundamental quality that the great episodes share. A quality that exists beneath all of these specific virtues. They believe in their characters. The great Simpsons episodes treat the people in them as real, not realistic. Springfield is never realistic. The jokes never stop. The cartoon physics are always operative, but real in the sense that the characters have inner lives that the episode takes seriously, that the characters' emotions are genuine within the logic of the show's world, that the things that happen to the characters matter in ways that the episode acknowledges. This is a more delicate achievement than it sounds, because the show's comic mode is inherently reductive. It uses character traits as joke delivery mechanisms. It requires characters to behave in ways that serve the comedy, even when those behaviors wouldn't quite serve the character's deeper nature. The great episodes manage to serve both. They are funny and they are true simultaneously in the same moments. The episode Lisa's Substitute is great because it is simultaneously a perfectly constructed comedy about a substitute teacher and a genuinely moving portrait of a child experiencing, for the first time, the specific disappointment of loving someone who sees you clearly and then leaves. The comedy doesn't undermine the emotion. The emotion doesn't interrupt the comedy. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. The episode Mother Simpson is great because the reunion between Homer and his mother is played for genuine feeling. The comedy of the situation is present, but it doesn't insulate the episode from the real emotional content of a son finding a mother he believed was dead. The show was willing, in that episode, to be actually sad, not as a trick, not as a subversion of audience expectation, but as an honest acknowledgement of what the story was actually about. The episode Homer's Enemy is great because it is willing to be uncomfortable, willing to follow a character whose function is to be the audience's surrogate of reasonableness into a world where being reasonable produces only suffering, and to end without reassurance. It is the show at its most honest about what Springfield actually is, stripped of the comedy buffer that usually makes Springfield's darkness bearable. Each of these episodes believes in something. The great episodes always believe in something. They have a commitment to a character, to an emotion, to an idea that gives them weight beyond the jokes. The not great episodes are not necessarily unfunny. Some of them are quite funny. What they lack is the commitment. They coast. They deliver jokes without believing in the material beneath the jokes. They produce comedy without producing meaning. The difference between these two kinds of episodes is the difference between entertainment and art. The Simpsons, at its peak, was art. Not because it was highbrow or inaccessible or formally experimental, because it believed in its characters deeply enough to make their stories matter. And the mattering is what elevates craft into art. The details we have been examining throughout this video are the evidence of belief. The refrigerator notes changed because someone believed in the family enough to maintain the fiction of their specificity. The ambient sound was calibrated because someone believed in Springfield enough to make it feel real. The character biographies were built across decades because the writers believed in these secondary characters enough to give them histories. Belief made visible in craft. That's what the great episodes are. That's what all the great details are. And that's what makes this show, at its best, one of the most extraordinary things anyone has made in the history of popular entertainment. Not because it is perfect, because it believed. Deep Dive, the show's final gift to its audience. After everything we've talked about, after the radiation theory and the coma theory and the institutional critiques and the character design secrets and the production code patterns and all the rest of it, there is a simple gift at the center of this show that is easy to miss because it is so obvious. The show loves its audience. This is not a given. Many shows are indifferent to their audience or contemptuous of it, or treat it as a demographic to be captured and retained rather than as a group of people who deserve the best work the makers can produce. The Simpsons, at its best, treats its audience as participants in the act of meaning-making, as people smart enough to catch the background detail, perceptive enough to feel the emotional truth beneath the joke, attentive enough to deserve the care that went into the things nobody had to notice. The refrigerator notes were for you. Not for you specifically. They were made before you watched, without knowing you would watch, without knowing your specific engagement with the show. But they were made in the spirit of respect for an audience that pays attention. They were made as a gift, placed in the background of a scene available to whoever looked. This gift-giving, this practice of doing more than was required, of making things for the viewer who pays attention, of distributing rewards for close reading throughout the visual and audio texture of the show, is the clearest expression of the show's love for its audience. You came to this show. You stayed. You paid attention. And the show, across 35 years, kept putting things in the margins for you to find. Not as manipulation, not as a strategy for retention, but as the natural expression of people who cared about what they were making and wanted that caring to be felt. Every detail you find in The Simpsons is a small confirmation. The people who made this cared about what they were making. They cared about you. They put something here for you to find. That's the show's final gift. Not the theories or the mythology or the institutional critique or the character depth, but all of which are real and valuable. The gift beneath all of that is simpler. Someone was thinking of you. They were thinking of the viewer who would pause the frame, who would lean in to read the background text, who would listen for the hum under the scene, who would track the background character across 20 seasons of appearances and assemble the fragments into a life. They were thinking of you, and they put something here for you. All of this, every hour we've spent in Springfield today, is you finding it. That's what The Simpsons is. That's what it's always been. A show made by people who cared, for people who cared, across 35 years of caring being expressed in every detail, every frame, every note of music, every background gag, every church sign, every refrigerator note, every ambient hum. Thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of attention to the shows you love. Leave a comment with the detail from today that surprised you most, the thing you'd never noticed before, the piece of Springfield you're going to look for next time you watch. Because there's always something else. There always will be. Springfield is waiting. Deep dive. The specific beauty of Springfield in autumn. There is a type of Simpsons episode, more common in the middle seasons, rare in the later ones, that is set unmistakably in autumn. The establishing shots of Springfield show the specific golden-brown palette of trees in transition. The light is different from the summer light that dominates most of the show's visual language. Cooler, lower, more directional. The kind of light that emphasizes texture and shadow rather than brightness. These autumn episodes have a specific emotional register that is not directly addressed by the storylines, but is present in every frame of their visual design. Autumn in the show's world carries associations that the show has developed carefully across its run. The beginning of the school year and the specific anxieties that attach to beginnings. The approach of the holiday season with its complicated emotional weight. And, beneath both of these, the basic seasonal fact of things ending. Of summer's long light giving way to the darkness that comes before winter. The autumn visual palette is the show's most melancholy register, and it tends to appear in episodes that are, beneath their surface comedy, exploring loss in some form. Bart struggling with the beginning of a new school year and what it might require of him. Homer in the specific autumn sadness of a man who feels, without being able to articulate it, that the year is running out and that he has not done what he meant to do with it. Lisa playing her saxophone in the late October light in the backyard, the sound carrying a specific quality of morning that the autumn air seems to produce. The show did not develop an explicit autumn mythology, did not make the seasonal setting a narrative element in most of these episodes. It simply established, over years of visual practice, that autumn Springfield has a specific emotional truth. And then it used that truth as the unstated atmosphere beneath the comedy. When you watch an autumn-set Simpsons episode now, knowing what you know about the show's visual language, the specific sadness of those episodes arrives before any plot element delivers it. The trees are turning, the light is low, something is ending. That's not a metaphor. It's just autumn. But in Springfield, autumn has always been the season for the things that are hardest to say directly. Deep dive, the geography of Homer's commute and what it says about daily life. Homer's commute to the nuclear plant is one of the show's most repeated narrative gestures. The opening credits show it. Dozens of episodes begin with it. It is part of the basic rhythm of the show's representation of daily life. Homer drives to work. Homer drives home from work. The commute is the hinge between domestic life and professional life, the transition space that everyone who commutes understands as its own specific psychological territory. The show has used this commute with extraordinary precision over the years because the commute is one of the few moments in Homer's day when he is genuinely alone, when the demands of family and of work have briefly suspended, and he occupies a transit space that belongs to neither. What Homer experiences in the commute tells you what Homer is going through at any given moment, more honestly than what Homer says or does in either context. In episodes where he is happy, the commute scenes are bright, brief, the car moving through a Springfield that is pleasant and easy. In episodes where he is troubled, the commute lingers, the road feels longer. The town outside the window has a quality of oppressiveness that the sunny establishing shots don't show. The commute has also been used to access Homer's interior life in ways that the show's usual external focus prevents. When Homer drives alone, he occasionally talks to himself, monologues, thinking out loud, the verbal processing of a mind that cannot contain its concerns in silence. These commute monologues are some of the show's most revealing character moments because they bypass the performance that Homer typically puts on for his family and his colleagues. They are Homer without audience, which means Homer without his usual defense mechanisms. The geography of the commute has been consistent enough that fans have been able to map it, to trace the route that Homer takes from Evergreen Terrace to the plant, to note the specific landmarks that appear in different episodes, to identify the visual vocabulary of the commute as its own distinct component of Springfield's geography. That geography tells you something about Springfield's spatial organization. The plant is not in the center of town, but it is never far. It sits at the edge of residential Springfield, close enough to be reached by a short drive, close enough that the cooling towers are visible from residential streets, close enough that the commute is not an escape from the plant's presence, but a transition into a slightly different relationship with it. You leave the house and you approach the plant. You leave the plant and you return to the house. The commute is the arc that connects these two realities. And both realities in Springfield are shaped by the same source. The plant that powers the house, the plant that Homer works at, the plant that poisons the water, that fills the glasses on the family's dinner table. The commute is not an escape. It is a different angle on the same situation. Homer drives to work every morning in the shadow of what is poisoning him, and the show has built this geography so carefully that you almost don't notice it. You just know the route. You've driven it with him hundreds of times. And every time you have, the plant has been there, on the horizon. Deep dive. The specific sadness of the later seasons and what it teaches us about creative longevity. The later seasons of The Simpsons are a subject that fans and critics discuss with a specific kind of discomfort that does not apply to the discussion of most long-running shows. The discomfort is not simply about quality decline. Many shows decline over time, and the decline is noted without the specific emotional charge that attends discussion of The Simpsons' later period. The charge comes from the distance between what the show was and what it became. The distance is large enough to be genuinely painful for people who love what it was, and the show's continued existence makes the distance continuously present rather than allowing it to be processed as a finished thing. The show is still running. It is still, in every episode, the same show and a different show simultaneously, carrying the visual identity, the character names, the Springfield setting, the basic premise, while doing something with that inheritance that is recognizably not what the peak years did. There are various ways to experience this. One way is as a kind of grief, mourning for the specific creative achievement of the peak seasons, which ended and has not returned. This is a legitimate response. The peak seasons were extraordinary, and the loss of them as an ongoing phenomenon is real. Another way is as evidence of something important about creative longevity, about what it costs to sustain a creative enterprise far beyond its natural lifespan, and what it means to continue when continuation requires accepting that the original conditions cannot be reproduced. The show has continued for reasons that have little to do with the creator's desire to revisit and express the creative vision of the peak seasons. It has continued because of institutional momentum, because of financial considerations, because it has become part of Fox's broadcast identity in ways that make discontinuation difficult, because the characters are cultural fixtures whose continued existence serves functions that have nothing to do with the quality of individual episodes. These are not shameful reasons. They are simply the reasons that long-running creative enterprises continue. The combination of love, habit, financial necessity, and cultural function that sustains things past the point where pure artistic motivation would sustain them alone. What the later seasons preserve, and this is genuinely worth preserving, is the continuity of the character's existence. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are still there, still on the couch, still at the plant and the school and the kitchen table. The family is intact. The town is intact. The basic grammar of Springfield's world is maintained. For the viewers who need the characters to still be there, who watch the later seasons not primarily for the quality of the episodes, but for the ongoing fact of the family's existence, this continuity has real value. It is not the value of art. It is the value of a reliable presence, of something that was there when you needed it and is still there now, imperfect and continued, and somehow still itself. The later seasons are not the best Simpsons, but they are Simpsons. And for a lot of people on a lot of Sunday evenings, that is enough. More than enough. The right thing at the right time in the specific comfort of the familiar. The show understood this about itself. That's why it continued. That's why it continues. Not because it can still do what it once did, because it is still here. And being still here after everything is its own kind of achievement. Deep dive. The lesson that Springfield keeps teaching. Every theory we have examined, every detail we have found, every pattern we have traced through the production data and the background art and the accumulated mythology of Springfield points toward the same lesson. The world is full of things you are not seeing, not because they are hidden, because you have not been looking. This is the fundamental lesson of paying close attention to The Simpsons, and it is a lesson that extends beyond the show. The refrigerator notes are in every kitchen you have ever known. The church sign has always been changing. The hum of something powerful has always been present in the background of your ordinary life. The background characters have always had histories more complex than their supporting cast function suggests. The show trained generations of viewers to look more carefully, to question the surfaces of familiar things, to read the details that no one was asking them to read, to find the second and third layers of meaning that exist beneath the first. This is what close reading does. This is what attention does. It finds more than the surface offers. The Simpsons is still teaching this lesson. Every episode, every detail, every background note change, and every ambient hum calibrated, and every production code that forms part of a larger pattern, all of it is an invitation to look more carefully. Not just at the show, at everything. At the refrigerator notes in your own kitchen that you have never read, at the signs on the buildings you drive past every morning without registering, at the hum under the ordinary sounds of your ordinary day, if you stop and listen for it, at the people in the background of your life who have histories you have never asked about, at the institutional failures that exist around you in forms you have normalized because normalization is how you survive them. At all of it. The show is not just entertainment, it is an instruction in how to see. You have been seeing more clearly since the day you first watched it. You will see more clearly still. That is the final lesson of Springfield. That is the gift the show keeps giving. That is what 35 years of someone changing the refrigerator notes for you has been building toward. The moment you realize that paying attention is the most important thing you can do, and the moment you look up from the screen and start doing it everywhere. Deep dive. The music that nobody wrote down. There is a category of musical moment in The Simpsons that is almost impossible to document and almost universally experienced. The moment when the underscore aligns so perfectly with the visual content that you feel something you did not expect to feel. And then the moment passes, and you are not sure what happened. These moments are different from the obvious emotional peaks. The deliberately constructed tearjerker moments where the music is doing its most explicit work, where the strings swell and the camera holds on a face and the show is clearly, intentionally trying to move you. Those moments are powerful in their own right. But the moments I am describing are more subtle. They arrive without announcement. They are gone before you have registered what they were, and they leave a trace that you can't quite locate. The music in these moments is doing something that the theory of emotional underscore doesn't fully account for. It is not illustrating the emotional content of the scene. It is not counterpointing it. It is something more specific. It is playing the emotion that exists just beneath the surface of the scene, the emotion that the characters themselves are not expressing and would not express, the private emotional truth of a moment that the show's comedy cannot directly acknowledge. This technique, playing the subtext, is the most advanced tool in The Simpsons composer's arsenal, and it appears most consistently in the episodes that are most highly regarded. The music in those episodes is not just accompaniment. It is a parallel narrative, running in the same time as the visual and verbal narrative, but speaking a different language, saying the things the words and the images cannot say. When Homer is at his most vulnerable, when the comedy momentarily drops away and something nakedly human is visible for a second before the joke comes back, the music has been there before the comedy dropped. It has been playing what the comedy was covering, has been holding the emotional truth in readiness for the moment when the comedy briefly permits its expression. This is the musical equivalent of the refrigerator notes, something that is there for you if you are paying the right kind of attention, invisible to those who are not. The composers who worked on this show understood this. They understood that they were serving a show that lived at the boundary between comedy and genuine emotion, and they scored for that boundary, for the specific territory between the joke and the feeling, where the most honest moments in the show exist. That territory is where Springfield is most true. Deep dive. The couch and what it means. We have spent a great deal of time in this video talking about what surrounds the Simpson family, the town, the institutions, the histories, the details. But there is one more thing worth visiting before we finish, and it is the simplest, most central image of the entire show. The couch. The couch in the Simpson living room is the show's most fundamental visual statement. It is where the family arrives at the end of the title sequence. It is where the couch gag happens. It is, in dozens of episodes, the space where family life is lived in its most basic form. The family gathered together in a shared space, watching television, sitting in proximity to each other, in the specific combination of togetherness and separateness that couch-watching television produces. The couch is not a luxury object. It is not an aspirational piece of furniture. It is a mid-range, slightly worn, entirely ordinary couch of the kind that exists in living rooms across America. The kind of couch that you choose because it is comfortable rather than because it is beautiful, that has survived years of use and carries the marks of that survival in its specific worn quality. Homer loves this couch. The show has shown us this. The couch, for Homer, is associated with the most reliable pleasures of his life. The beer, the television, the family nearby, the specific comfort of a tired body in a familiar seat at the end of a day. The couch is where Homer is most fully himself, most completely in the moment, most entirely present to the specific happiness of having what he has. The couch is where the show always ends up. Not just narratively, not just because the title sequence ends there and the couch gag happens there, but thematically. Every episode, whatever has happened, whatever has gone wrong, whatever has been overcome or failed to be overcome, ends with the family in roughly the same configuration. The couch is the anchor. The couch is the thing that doesn't change. In a show about a town where nothing ages and time doesn't pass, the couch is the symbol of that suspension. It is there in Season 1 and there in Season 35 in the same form, holding the same family in the same living room at the same address. Nothing has changed. Everything is still here. That is either a tragedy or a comfort, depending on where you are in life when you are watching. For Homer, it is always a comfort. For Lisa, watching the same life happen around her, from the same position on the same couch across 35 years, it is something more complicated. For Marge, maintaining the couch and the room around it and the family that gathers on it, It is the ongoing work of her life, the thing that is worth the effort and the sacrifice and the patience, visible every evening in its ordinary, beautiful, reliable form. For Bart, sprawled on it in the specific posture of a child who is exactly at home in his own home, it is the thing he would never admit to needing, but would never be able to do without. For Maggie, who knows everything and says nothing, the couch is where she sits among her family and watches and waits. They are all on the couch. After everything, still on the couch. That is what The Simpsons is. That is what it has always been. That is what all 35 years of details and theories and hidden messages and background art and ambient sound and production codes have been in service of. The family on the couch. Still there, still together, still Springfield. Deep dive. The last word on Springfield. Springfield is not a real place. You know this. You have always known this. And yet you have spent time there, real time, hours of your actual life, sitting in front of a screen, watching a family of yellow cartoon people navigate an impossible town that contradicts itself geographically, biologically, and temporally in ways no real place ever could. You have laughed in Springfield. You have cried in Springfield, or nearly cried, in those specific moments when the show was at its most honest and the comedy dropped away for just long enough to let the feeling through. You have been surprised by Springfield, and moved by it, and delighted by it, and occasionally frustrated by it, in the specific way you are frustrated by something you love that is not living up to itself. Springfield is not real, but your time there was real. The experiences were real. The feelings were real. The things the show taught you about how to look at the world, about institutions and power and family and loneliness, and the specific comedy of human beings trying and failing and trying again. Those are real, and they are in you now, and they will shape how you see things for the rest of your life, whether you are watching The Simpsons or not. That is what great art does. It is not real, and yet it makes you more real. It gives you frameworks for experience that you use outside of itself, that accompany you into the parts of your life that have nothing to do with the art. The Simpsons gave generations of people frameworks for understanding American institutional life, American family life, American comedy as a mode of engaging with things that hurt. It gave them characters who were, in their specific flawed humanity, more recognizable than the idealized characters of other stories. It gave them a town that, for all its impossibility, felt like the place they grew up in, or would have grown up in, or had grown up in and left, or had never left and were still in, the specific quality of American small city life captured in a yellow cartoon world with better accuracy than most journalism manages. All of this happened because someone changed the refrigerator notes, because someone calibrated the clouds, because someone built a mythology out of throwaway lines without being asked to, and because the mythology turned out to be true. Details matter. Attention matters. Care matters. This is the thing Springfield has been teaching from the beginning. Pay attention. The details are where the truth lives. It's always been there. In the refrigerator notes and the church sign and the ambient hum and the production codes and the background art and the throwaway lines and the faces of people in the margins of scenes, living entire lives that the camera never quite stops for. In the couch that holds the family. In the town that never ages. In the show that never ends. In Springfield, which is everywhere, which is all of us, which has always been saying, look more closely, there's more here than you think.